buenas tardes a todos, ¿cómo están? ¿Cómo les va?
Muy bien.
Bueno, miren, vamos a empezar y después se van a ir incorporando los siguientes, que tal como les va. Tenemos gente de toda América Latina y el Caribe, legisladores, diplomáticos, gente del sector privado, profesores, estudiantes. Bueno, vamos a dar comienzo, disculpen la voz, a la clase número 10. Creo que vas a tener que decir, hablar el programa de estudios americanos. Adelante.
Pues buenas tardes, me gusta mucho ver a todos los invitados otra vez. Como decía Juan, seguimos con los cursos. Voy a, principio, decir que a las 6 vamos a reunir con Danny Heck, el vicegobierno de gobernador del Estado de Washington. Estuvo un congresista, un legislador, entrepreneur, hecho muchos papeles, es un chico, un señor, chico, es un amigo mío, muy fantástico y tenemos muchas ganas, pero al principio tenemos otros invitados. Voy a dejar a Juan para introducirle y gracias por venir. Gracias.
Por favor, vamos a escuchar en primer lugar a Adrián Mínguez, que es abogado egresado de la Universidad de Buenos Aires, que tiene un posgrado en Derecho Empresario en la UAD, en la Universidad Argentina de la Empresa. También tiene estudios en Relaciones Internacionales en la Escuela Diplomática de Madrid. Es miembro consultor del Consejo Argentino para las Relaciones Internacionales, del CARI, y es co-chairman del Comité Internacional de la American Chamber of Commerce del capítulo de Argentina. Tiene, por supuesto, un currículum mucho más frondoso, pero me parece que es bastante suficiente con esta descripción. Adelante, Adrián, por favor.
Muchas gracias. Gracias a ambos y gracias a la audiencia. Estoy un poco inhibido porque me han dicho que hay muchos expertos en relaciones internacionales, en derecho internacional, políticos, diplomáticos, y voy a hacer un chiste un poco impropio, pero más que nada para pasar este primer momento. Me siento, después de haber leído todo el programa y todos los que ya han dado previamente y los que van a dar, como el octavo marido de Elizabeth Taylor en la noche de bodas. O sea, sé lo que tengo que hacer, pero no sé si lo voy a hacer interesante. Así que, dicho esto, políticamente incorrecto, en los tiempos que corren, lo primero, y vamos a la primera filmina, esa es la presentación. Tenemos una agenda que quizás sea un poquito diferente, vamos a la primera. Yo pensé primero en una introducción, esa introducción ahora enseguida van a ver de qué se trata, con un enfoque y un contexto, y dentro de ese contexto vamos a tratar de desarrollar algunas ideas. Por supuesto que incluí algún tema, sobre todo por mi vinculación con la Cámara Norteamericana de Comercio de la Argentina y por la agenda en general del programa del comercio de bienes y servicios entre la Argentina y los Estados Unidos. Y después preferí centrarme en la Argentina en el comercio internacional o la Argentina y el comercio internacional. Parece una tontería, pero luego voy a explicar por qué esta diferencia, si es Argentina en el comercio o y el comercio. Luego, si tenemos políticas de Estado, o por lo menos desde el sector privado se ven las políticas de Estado, cómo estamos con la seguridad jurídica, y por último, entendiendo la realidad. ¿Qué me parece a mí, por supuesto, que debería hacerse o cuáles deberían ser los cambios recomendados? Vamos a la siguiente, Juan. Bueno, en este enfoque, como les decía, la primera idea es compartir con ustedes algunos pensamientos que se derivan de experiencias personales. No es por vanidad. Lo cuento brevemente para que se entienda por qué voy a llegar a donde pretendo llegar. A lo largo de mi vida profesional y académica me ha tocado estar en distintos roles. Me ha tocado estar como funcionario de planta permanente en el Estado, especialmente en la aduana, y negociando normas del Mercosur, y también como representante de la aduana en la Organización Mundial de Aduanas, en Bélgica. Con lo cual tengo esa primera mirada de qué pasa en esos ámbitos cuando uno tiene que negociar normas internacionales o tiene que representar al Estado en un foro internacional. La segunda cuestión tiene que ver con mi vida académica. Yo soy profesor de Derecho Internacional Público, así que estoy muy apegado a las leyes, a las normas, y me cuesta a veces salir de las normas. Reconozco que lo mío está emparentado a veces con relaciones internacionales y con política internacional, pero más sujeto al marco y al escenario, que es bastante más rígido que eso. Y por último, a la vida profesional, ya una vez salido de la función pública, primero en una gran consultora y ahora en un estudio público, donde uno ve problemas concretos de los particulares, de las grandes, de las medianas y de las pequeñas empresas que intentan participar del comercio internacional. Y por último, por supuesto, actuando desde el año 1998 en la Cámara Norteamericana, donde uno ve también problemas que traen los socios, que están vinculados muchas veces con la normativa y con trabas al comercio. También les traje algunos números. Esto es, como les decía, bueno, algo que tenga que ver con cómo está hoy el comercio entre Estados Unidos y la República Argentina. Seguramente Beatriz Nofal, que nos va a acompañar luego, pueda darnos más precisiones. Y después algunas tareas que yo entiendo pendientes desde el lado del poder político o gubernamental. Como sé que también hay miembros acá de legislaturas y demás, me interesaría levantar esos puntos. Vamos al siguiente. Bueno, acá les traje un par de cuadros. Yo no soy economista, me gusta la economía, pero para los que gustan de los números, esto está extraído de un informe que ustedes pueden levantar directamente de la Cámara Argentina de Comercio y Servicios. Es un informe que preparó la Cámara para especialmente la visita que hizo el presidente de los argentinos al presidente BAIRD hace muy poquito tiempo. Acá un poco se centran o se exhibe la cantidad o el comercio bilateral Argentina-Estados Unidos en millones de dólares corrientes, importaciones, exportaciones. Probablemente acá mi segundo comentario hoy totalmente incorrecto, pero como decía un profesor mío de la Escuela Diplomática, así que estoy parafraseando, no lo invento yo, las estadísticas a veces y estos cuadros son como los bikinis, ¿no? Dejan ver mucho, pero no lo más importante. Yo lo que quiero referenciar aquí es que uno puede analizar un poco la evolución, pero uno debería desagregar realmente estos números para tener una visión cierta de a qué nos estamos refiriendo. Y pongo un ejemplo sencillo, a lo mejor burdo, y ustedes me pueden retar luego, pero yo diría, bueno, pareciera que acá estamos siempre con déficit, ¿no? En la balanza siempre tenemos más importaciones de los Estados Unidos que exportaciones de la Argentina, pero mi respuesta a eso es, bueno, depende de qué es lo que estoy importando y qué es lo que estoy exportando. Si lo dijera seriamente, yo podría decir, bueno, si estoy importando bienes de capital para luego producir y a lo mejor exportar a otros mercados que no se ve reflejado en este cuadro, estaría bien. Si yo quisiera hacer un comentario menos sólido, podría decirle, bueno, si en realidad las barras de color rojo, que representan las importaciones, fuera que estoy importando dólares, que en definitiva es una mercadería, estaría excelentemente bien, porque estaría ingresando mucho más dólares que lo que estoy pagando por ellos, que serían las exportaciones. O sea que yo creo que este cuadro, si bien es interesante, luego hay que desagregarlo como para tener una idea cierta de dónde estamos concentrados y qué estamos haciendo. Vamos a la siguiente, que es parecida, pero en realidad tiene el comercio bilateral total, ¿no? Argentina, Estados Unidos. Yo me traje un par de, y si vamos a la siguiente, porque total estos números se van a quedar, esto me lo puse como ayuda a memoria, ¿no? Importaciones argentinas en 2022 a Estados Unidos, en bienes 5.402 millones. Estos son datos que he sacado de la página de Cancillería Argentina, o sea que asumo que son correctos. Después Argentina exportó servicios, que Argentina está con una impronta destacada en lo que es exportación de servicios. La exportación total de servicios superó los 14.000 millones de dólares. Este total, casi el 30% fueron exportaciones a los Estados Unidos de América. Y en lo que hace exportación de servicios basados en el conocimiento, ahí del total exportado a Estados Unidos, el 44% fue servicios basados en el conocimiento. Acá traté un poco de, sí, hacer algún tipo de disgregación como para entender un poco más cuando hablamos de servicios, porque servicios, ustedes saben que abarca mucho, están desde los servicios de turismo, de transporte, y bueno, también los servicios basados en el conocimiento, que es donde yo decía, Argentina hoy quizá está desarrollando una plataforma interesante. Podemos ir a la siguiente. Gracias. Dicho esto, y ahora paso a un plano más general, incluye las relaciones con Estados Unidos, pero también las relaciones de Argentina con el resto del mundo. Yo me planteé Argentina en el o y el comercio internacional. Y esa diferencia tiene que ver con si Argentina está inserto en el comercio mundial, o si en realidad para Argentina el comercio mundial está siendo un problema. Por eso digo Argentina en él porque participa, o Argentina y él porque hoy no deja de ser un problema. Y cuando digo un problema es porque la percepción que uno tiene es que a veces internamente estamos complicando más nuestra inserción en el mundo. En algún momento la Argentina representó el 3.5%, no sé si llegó al 4% del comercio mundial. Hoy Argentina representa el 0.25% del comercio mundial. Acá voy a traer alguna anécdota vieja, pero bueno, una de las anécdotas también aprende. Yo estaba en una consultora internacional, año 2002, después de la crisis argentina. Argentina sale de la convertibilidad, cepo cambiario, parecido ahora, imposibilidad de girar dividendos y hacer otros tipos de pagos. Visita Argentina, el representante de una automotriz multinacional, queriendo que le giren utilidades y dividendos. Se le explica que no se podía girar utilidades y dividendos, y de muy mal humor dijo: por lo que ustedes representan en el total de mi compañía, yo estoy pensando cerrar. O sea, le traía más problemas que soluciones. Está bien, puede haber sido también un exabrupto, puede haber sido una chicana, puede haber sido lo que ustedes quieran, pero lo cierto es que a nadie le gusta escuchar eso. No piensa siempre en las inversiones, ¿no? Y en el desarrollo. Y que venga alguien a decir: mire, usted me complica tanto la vida, que levanto todo y me voy, sobre todo tratándose de la industria automotriz, realmente a uno lo preocupa. No se puede, esta compañía de autos siguió en la Argentina. Pero bueno, por eso el arranque es Argentina en el o y el comercio internacional. Yo creo que lo primero es una necesidad que nos está faltando, y recién conversamos acá, perdón que traiga este tema, sobre todo para los demás asistentes de países fuera de la Argentina y del resto de América, pero estamos en proceso eleccionario. Ayer hubo un debate de los candidatos presidenciales, y este tema surge sobre todo porque yo entiendo que hay una necesidad de definir principios básicos en lo que es la relación de la República Argentina con el resto del mundo. Una de esas cuestiones tiene que ver, yo lo puse simplemente, a lo mejor suena agresivo, ¿no? País rico versus país pobre. Argentina fue un país rico, no me quiero quedar con esa historia, porque estamos hablando ya de hace muchos años, ¿no? Ya después de la década del 60, Argentina notoriamente dejó de, o empezó a declinar en ese sentido. Pero yo creo que en algún momento hay que tomar esa decisión de decir: bueno, ¿a quién me quiero parecer? A mí me ha pasado de estar en alguna reunión con algún funcionario de hace 2 administraciones atrás y decirle mínimamente, porque antes uno decía, cuando yo era chico, uno se comparaba a lo mejor con Europa, o incluso con Estados Unidos. En esa conversación, 2006, más o menos 2008, yo le decía: bueno, ¿y si nos parecemos a Uruguay o hacemos las cosas como Chile? Y entonces la respuesta, ¿cuál fue? No, nosotros queremos hacer las cosas como Venezuela. Entonces uno dice: bueno, pero esto es como si yo viera jugar equipos, ¿no?, de distintos equipos del mundo. Yo quiero ser del equipo que gana, no del equipo que pierde. O sea, explíqueme su lógica, porque yo no la entiendo, sinceramente. No la entiendo. No puedo entender que alguien quiera pertenecer al equipo de los que no ganan. Así que creo que ahí hay una primera definición. La otra definición es país desarrollado versus país subdesarrollado. Nosotros hemos tenido políticas desde los 70 que nos convencieron, nos empujaron, nos llevaron a esta creencia, y esto es como la profecía autocumplida, ¿no? Se logró lo que se decía en aquel momento que éramos, y a lo mejor todavía no lo éramos, y ahora ya lo somos, con un 40% de pobres. Pero yo creo que también se necesita una definición, o sea, ¿a qué mundo queremos pertenecer o qué queremos ser? Y sobre esto también va concatenado si queremos estar integrados al mundo o aislados. Y esto lo vemos, por ejemplo, en Mercosur. Estas discusiones que hemos tenido últimamente en el Mercosur, especialmente con Uruguay y con Paraguay, donde los otros socios dicen, nos gustaría la apertura, y nosotros salimos a decirle, bueno, pero en realidad hay una resolución del Consejo, del Comité, del año. A ver, ¿querés ser o no querés ser? Porque las normas todos sabemos que se pueden cambiar, sobre todo si todos están de acuerdo. Entonces, salir a decir, no, bueno, pero en realidad hay una, y no, y ustedes no pueden, y no sé, bueno, no querés. Entonces, yo creo que hay que blanquear, y por eso digo necesidad de definir principios básicos. Algunos lo definirían como políticas de Estado, y que me parecería muy bien. Nosotros, lamentablemente, yo creo que no tenemos políticas de Estado, y entonces dependemos de las políticas de gobierno, ¿no? Para los que hacemos derecho internacional, Estado y Gobierno son dos cosas distintas. El Gobierno, como dicen en Estados Unidos, es la administración, y la administración puede tener una inclinación para hacer algunas cosas con más deseo que otras. Pero lo que no podemos, creo yo, es condenar al Estado por lo que piensa la administración, que es pasajera en última instancia. Vamos a la siguiente. Yo listé acá 2 o 3 cuestiones que me parecen fundamentales, y también con algunos ejemplos para que esto no sea tan aburrido, ¿no? Lo primero es lo que hace la seguridad jurídica, y cuando hablo de la seguridad jurídica digo, tanto la Constitución Nacional como los tratados, que para los que no son argentinos, en nuestra Constitución Nacional los tratados tienen jerarquía superior a las leyes, o sea que los tratados, no puede haber leyes que deroguen tratados, sino que los tratados se imponen sobre las leyes. Después tenemos las leyes, y hay cuestiones que yo puse 2 acá. Argentina en 2015 firmó el Acuerdo de Facilitación del Comercio de la OMS. Todos contentos y recitando algunos de los principios que trae el acuerdo, que me parecen valiosísimos. Ahora, el principio de publicidad del acuerdo, que es el principio de publicidad de los actos, es propio de cualquier república seria y está en nuestra Constitución. Entonces, en realidad no necesitamos del acuerdo para saber que tenemos que hacer publicidad de los actos públicos, los actos de gobierno. Pero seguimos a veces con estas cuestiones de que hay resoluciones que nunca se publican, o mecanismos extraños para determinar una alícuota de un impuesto que lo calcula, perdón que me vaya, no por las ramas, pero es un caso que hoy se está discutiendo en la justicia. En un momento, en el 2008 o 2010, hace 2 administraciones atrás, o 3, se había impuesto un nuevo derecho de exportación, cuyo cálculo quedaba supeditado a un ente administrativo que se llamaba Unidad Interdisciplinaria, que se reunían en reuniones secretas, ellos decían cuál era la alícuota, que se la hacían saber a la aduana, y entonces la aduana después venía y decía, mire que tal día no estaba vigente la alícuota que usted puso, había otra, le voy a cobrar la diferencia. Yo decía, pero es que nunca me enteré, eso no estaba publicado. Bueno, no, pero usted sabía que el mecanismo establecía que había una unidad que lo iba a establecer, así que si lo establece en el futuro no importa, usted también lo sabe. La irretroactividad de la norma. Bueno, es una locura. Hoy todo eso se está discutiendo en la justicia, y la verdad no ayuda al comercio internacional. No ayuda. Otro ejemplo es el del debido proceso. Todos sabemos del debido proceso, también está en la Constitución Nacional. Bueno, el acuerdo de facilitación dice que frente a las controversias que uno tenga, debe haber un proceso claro, rápido, transparente. Todo eso ya lo sabemos. Ahora necesitamos volver a firmar un acuerdo y tampoco lo cumplimos. Y acá me voy a dos casos que sí nos emparentan mucho con los Estados Unidos. Argentina tiene tratados de protección bilateral de inversiones con Estados Unidos. En esos tratados está desarrollada la forma en que se pueden hacer los reclamos. Y la forma en que se hacen los reclamos es que uno tiene que ir a los tribunales arbitrales del CIAD. Entonces ahí después tenemos las defensas argentinas. Yo lo reconozco, yo como abogado defensor probablemente si tuviera que defenderlo usaría algunos de estos argumentos. Pero lo cierto es que lo que no puedo es en conversaciones privadas con políticos y diplomáticos que me aleguen esa defensa. ¿Qué puede ser una defensa procesal? Como la prórroga de jurisdicción. Me enojo porque me llevan a otro país a litigar. Pero es que ya lo resolví antes, está escrito en el tratado, que es así. Si no me gusta que me lleven a otro país, me salgo del tratado y no hay ningún problema. Ahora, me quedo en el tratado, pero no me gusta que me lleven a litigar al CIAD. Pero es que no puedo todo en la vida. Entonces, cuando elijo, ya elegí. Algo parecido pasa, y esto ustedes lo habrán visto, sobre todo lo que vivimos acá en la Argentina, con la privatización de YPF, donde también, cuando Argentina emite deuda, prorroga su jurisdicción, renuncia a la inmunidad de jurisdicción. Esto en los estados, ustedes saben que tienen inmunidad de jurisdicción y de ejecución. O sea, un estado, salvo que renuncie, no puede ser llevado a los estrados de otro estado para ser juzgado. ¿Por qué? Porque ambos son soberanos. Ahora, si yo renuncio, ya renuncié. ¿Por qué renuncia la Argentina? Bueno, porque como quiere colocar la deuda, lo primero que le dice es que va a comprar la deuda, y no pensemos en ¿cómo se llaman los fondos buitres? La tercera o cuarta mano que se hace de la deuda. Pensemos cuando coloca deuda al principio, el que va a prestar le dice, bueno, y si tenemos un problema, ¿dónde lo vamos a dirimir? Y entonces, en el prospecto se pone, bueno, si hay un problema, y hay una prórroga de jurisdicción, por ejemplo, en los tribunales de Nueva York. Lo escribí cuando quise colocar la deuda. Coloqué la deuda. Me fue mal. Me volteé. Se vendieron esa deuda y ahora hay alguien que viene y me ejecuta. Y entonces me quejo porque me llevan a litigar a Nueva York. Pero es que yo ya me obligué a ir a Nueva York. Entonces no es una cuestión nueva. No es algo que de golpe aparece. No es algo que sea arbitrario. Entonces yo creo que ahí estamos fallando. Realmente estamos fallando todas las administraciones. Porque nadie encara, de verdad, el problema de decir, bueno, si soy el deudor, tengo que pagar. Yo lo veo a lo mejor demasiado claro y no es así. Vamos a la siguiente. A esta le puse entendiendo la realidad. Y le puse entendiendo la realidad por varias razones. Primero porque el mundo es dinámico y cambiante. Acá no estoy diciendo nada, es una verdad de perogrullo. Cuando digo que es dinámico y cambiante, lo que quiero significar es, escucho que hay gente que sigue hablando de la Argentina potencia de hace 100 años atrás. Bueno, ya pasó. Hay otros que hablan de los 70, o de cuando Argentina estaba desarrollando el avión jet, no sé cuánto, claro, y el Pulqui, y que entonces por el golpe de Estado el proyecto quedó sin concluirse. Pasaron 70 años. Entonces, quien no se da cuenta de eso, que en 70 años ¿qué hicimos? Supongamos que en ese momento se abortó ese proyecto. Hoy día, y esto ustedes lo saben también o más que yo, un particular que tiene ganas de ir a Marte se fabrica su propio cohete. Entonces, a lo que voy es, yo a lo mejor soy muy pesimista en esto, pero digo, el mundo va por otro lado. El mundo va por otro lado. Hay un particular que tiene un patrimonio tal que le permite decirle a la NASA, mire, usted era antes el que tenía el monopolio de los viajes al espacio. Ahora no lo tiene más. Porque ahora yo también. Y hay gente que hace turismo espacial. Quien no se da cuenta de esa realidad, del dinamismo que está adquiriendo el mundo, y con esto también el comercio, se queda a un lado. Quienes siguen protegiendo al fabricante de... cada tanto yo veo que la Argentina abre investigaciones lo digo porque un día fui a buscar de qué se trataba, porque no entendía, pero cada 5 o 6 años Argentina abre una investigación por importación de brocas helicoidales. Es una herramienta, digamos. Bueno, es histórico, y yo lo veo en el boletín oficial. Ahora, si vamos a seguir discutiendo sobre tornillos, probablemente estamos atrasando. Entonces, yo lo que creo, claro, es que, ahora, como contrapartida, porque tampoco es negativo, como contrapartida tenemos una gran exportación de servicios. El problema, como vamos a ver ahora, es que hay regulaciones que hacen que los exportadores de servicios finalmente pongan sus plataformas en otros países, y no en la Argentina. Por eso el que sigue es muy parecido, no podemos partir de ideologías sino de intereses. El mundo se maneja por intereses, y esto no está mal. Esto no está mal, porque en el comercio, indudablemente hay intereses. Como en la política también hay intereses. Y yo creo que esto es más que importante. Hay una tercera cuestión que lo discutí mucho en algún momento y no le voy a echar la culpa a las estadísticas en este caso, pero los exportadores y los importadores son los individuos y no es el Estado. A veces, por esto de armar las estadísticas, no nosotros decimos el Estado exporta, el Estado importa, y la balanza del Estado no es la balanza, es la balanza a los fines estadísticos de poder sacar cuentas. Pero en realidad es cada uno de los individuos que hizo su inversión y que quiere exportar. Y a esto voy a llegar al final de todo. Y esos individuos son los que necesitan las respuestas, no el Estado. Solo que lo vivieron en un Estado comunista, y entonces tuvieron una centralidad del poder y es el Estado, ¿no?, el dueño de todos los bienes de producción. Pero no es nuestra realidad. Entonces, esto de decir, bueno, no, porque el Estado, o va en beneficio del Estado, yo creo que primero hay que ver a cada particular que exporta y a cada particular que importa. Y acá puse 3 frases que van concatenadas, diferentes escalas, y me refiero al tamaño de la empresa, diferentes problemas, diferentes asesoramientos, diferentes demandas y diferentes soluciones, que me faltó poner ahí. ¿Qué quiero decir con esto? Esto también es un poco de la experiencia de haber estado en multinacionales, y uno cuando viene a una empresa multinacional a consultar, por ejemplo, quiero participar, quiero hacer exportaciones al Mercosur, o analicemos cómo puedo en su momento exportar al NAFTA, y esa empresa tiene un equipo a lo mejor de 5 o 6 personas internas que también van a acompañar el proceso, y ven y contratan a un consultor que en realidad parte de un montón de presupuestos y lo que analiza es el impacto tributario, los acuerdos para evitar la doble imposición, un montón de cuestiones pero que están en un nivel superior. Ahora, en algún momento, después de la crisis, la Cámara Norteamericana había hecho un programa que era ir al interior del país justamente para fomentar la exportación, tanto de bienes como de servicios, a Estados Unidos. Y ahí nos encontramos, yo me encontré con una realidad totalmente distinta. Gente que se acercaba al final de la charla y me decía, no, yo quiero exportar, y lo que quería saber es si usted me explica el sistema de curia. Entonces yo decía, ¿por qué? ¿Usted qué manda? ¿Manda repuestos? No, yo mando, no me acuerdo qué era, pero ¿de cuánto estamos hablando? Le digo yo. Pero reconozco ahí mi ingenuidad y mi incapacidad para darme cuenta de esa realidad, a lo mejor porque estaba inmerso en otra realidad. Y el tipo me dice, no, yo exporto $10.000 por mes, le digo, yo no por año. Bueno, claro, el señor que exportaba $10.000 por año, ni siquiera contrataba un contador que le dijera qué tenía que hacer, que era menos de $1.000 por mes. Entonces lo que él buscaba era, bueno, dígame la vía más barata y más simple para que yo coloque mi producto en otro país. En ese momento yo me sentí inútil, porque yo esa respuesta lamentablemente no se la podía dar. A lo mejor era la más simple de todas, pero no era algo habitual, porque nadie me consultaba a mí sobre el sistema de curva. Entonces, ahí yo creo que tenemos un gran problema, porque cuando a mí me ha tocado ir, por ejemplo, a Cancillería, a veces a charlas o asesoramientos, lo que uno se da cuenta es que o enfocan mucho hacia la pequeña empresa, y entonces las soluciones son muy puntuales, porque cada uno tiene un problema puntual, o se van directamente a los grandes proyectos, y la verdad que ahí no le solucionan a los pequeños. ¿Qué quiero decir con esto? Por ejemplo, cuando se negocian acuerdos de libre comercio, o temas como el de Sur Unión Europea, y vienen las listas con los productos, ahí es donde empiezan a hacer agua, porque todos tienen algo de protección, y esto hay que reconocerlo, porque esto es ida y vuelta. A nadie le gusta quedar, entre comillas, desprotegido frente a la competencia, y si uno no conoce realmente de qué se trata, cuesta mucho aparecer límites. En esto un comentario adicional con los Estados Unidos. Cuando uno rastrea, tenemos esas relaciones históricas. Estados Unidos fue, no sé si no el primer estado que reconoció, si uno de los primeros, 1818 o 1820, por ahí, a la Argentina como estado independiente. Pero bueno, a lo que iba es, si ustedes van a la página de la Organización Mundial del Comercio, entre los dos estados tenemos demandas cruzadas por temas de dumping, sobre todo en limones, sobre todo en Estados Unidos, exportación de limones desde la Argentina, y también problemas con la exportación de caños, y también hemos tenido viceversa, demandas de la Argentina a Estados Unidos. Pero yo digo, bueno, eso es como en cualquier matrimonio, ¿no? Nos llevamos bien y a veces, nada, hay cuestiones que son controversiales y se resolverán. En algún momento se resolverán. Pero es mejor, creo yo, resolverlas entre amigos, no entre adversarios. Uso de herramientas. Acá esto que puse de lo transitorio a lo permanente, y puse licencias, controles de cambio. ¿Por qué? Porque en realidad, si ustedes van al GATT, al viejo GATT, al Acuerdo General, al del 47, y acuerdos que salieron como consecuencia del GATT, van a ver que, incluso hay ahora un acuerdo especial sobre licencias dentro de la Organización Mundial del Comercio, que Argentina a veces utiliza herramientas que están previstas en los tratados internacionales. El problema es que esas herramientas están previstas como herramientas transitorias, mientras dure el periodo de tiempo hasta que las cosas se acomoden. El tema de licencias previas es uno. Y el tema de controles de cambio también, hasta que uno logre equiparar la balanza. El problema es que nosotros nunca logramos equiparar la balanza, siempre tenemos problemas, y entonces hacemos de lo transitorio algo permanente. Y cuando uno hace de lo transitorio algo permanente, indudablemente comienza a haber problemas. Porque cada vez se traban más las importaciones y cada vez, con el control de cambios, tengo menos exportaciones. Y acá viene un poco el tema de quién puede utilizar una vía alternativa. Y digo, bueno, fundar una nueva sociedad e ir a otro país y vender, por ejemplo, servicios que es más fácil desde otro país, lo hace desde otro país, donde no tengan control de cambio. Pero yo creo que en esto no hay que perseguir a la persona que hace esto, porque en definitiva lo que estás buscando es hacer negocio. No digo que lo haga de manera ilegal, no, para nada, ¿no? Sino que él buscará la mejor manera de hacer su negocio, de manera lícita. Y si acá tiene muchas complicaciones, lo va a terminar haciendo en otro lugar, donde tendrá menos complicaciones. El problema es cuando las complicaciones las genero yo mismo. Y ahí se genera otro problema más, que es, y volvemos a la seguridad jurídica, cuando el Estado pretende comprar compulsivamente las divisas del exportador a un tipo de cambio ficticio, indudablemente la gente va a tratar de evitarlo, como pueda, como sea. Si le pagara el valor de mercado, indudablemente no tendría ese problema, pero es que es ficticio. Y lo mismo le pasa al importador, que cuando quiere comprar el dólar a ese valor ficticio que dice el Estado, está el dólar, no se lo venden, no hay cupo. ¿Por qué? Bueno, es un problema de oferta y demanda. Si está muy bajo el precio, va a haber muchos que quieren comprar y ninguno que quiere vender. Entonces, el Banco Central no quiere vender, y todos los importadores quieren comprar, porque quieren comprar barato, porque mañana va a estar. Entonces, uno a veces no entiende cuál es la lógica. La lógica, a ver, uno le entiende, no hay dólares, ya no tengo. Me blanquear y ya no tengo, entonces ya no tengo que vender. Entonces, a partir de ahí sí podemos solucionar. Y acá cierro con esto. Bueno, el tema de las expectativas, ¿no? Yo creo que hay cambios que están siendo impulsados por la realidad y por la propia gente. Y acá un poco concluyo redondeando esta idea que ayer escuchábamos a los futuros candidatos, y varios de ellos están con esta idea de, si el sistema no sirve, tenemos que insertarnos en el mundo, tenemos que posibilitar a los exportadores que exporten, y tenemos que bajar la carga impositiva. Sin duda. Bueno, muchas gracias, y quedo abierto a preguntas.
Vamos entonces a preguntas y respuestas. Nos vamos a ir turnando con los que están de forma remota y aquellos que están aquí presentes. Por favor, se presentan. Víctor Albures, de Guatemala, adelante.
Muchas gracias, Juan de Dios. Gracias al expositor magistral, su conferencia. Yo soy Víctor Albures, de la República de Guatemala. Me llama la atención y qué opina cuando habla que los importadores y los exportadores son los individuos y no el Estado. Pero por supuesto creo que debe existir una sinergia y políticas públicas que puedan darle esa fortaleza al que importa y al que exporta. ¿Qué opinión tiene de eso?
Nos cortó un poquito de la pregunta en un momento, quedaste congelado, pero te pediría si la podés reiterar. Gracias.
Sí, gracias. Manifestaba usted que los exportadores y los importadores son los individuos, no el Estado.
Sí.
Desde mi punto de vista, en nuestros países, más América Latina, por supuesto que debe existir esa sinergia entre el Estado y los individuos. ¿Qué opinión merece que existan mejores políticas públicas para que sí haya una vinculación entre ambos?
Totalmente, totalmente. Yo te diría que un poco mi crítica va apuntada a eso, pero previo a esas políticas públicas me parece que hay que ponerse de acuerdo a dónde queremos llegar, porque para poder diseñar una buena política pública, primero tengo que saber cuál es mi destino para poder elegir el camino. Entonces, lo primero es, si yo garantizo la propiedad privada, si yo me comprometo a no confiscar más a los exportadores cuando cobran sus exportaciones comprándoles los dólares a el cambio ficticio, si yo me comprometo a bajar la presión tributaria, nosotros en Argentina tenemos algunos impuestos que son terriblemente, si digo antipático, soy demasiado bueno. El derecho a exportación que nosotros ponemos normalmente, ha habido derecho a exportación para todos los productos de la nomenclatura, pero bueno, especialmente se le ponen altas tasas a los productos del campo. ¿Por qué? Bueno, porque es parte de la idea de que somos eficientes en ese aspecto, pero pensemos que ese derecho a exportación ha llegado en algún caso, que tuvo que ser discutido y llegó a la Corte Suprema, hasta el 47,5% del valor FOB. ¿Qué quiero decir con esto? Si alguien exportaba y su valor FOB era 100, antes de salir de la Argentina tenía que pagar el 47,5 de 100. O sea que ya cuando salía el producto, la ganancia, a ver, lo que restaba, porque estamos hablando de un bruto, estamos hablando del total, del valor FOB, ya le estaban quedando $53, ¿no? De los 100. Si después encima le van a pagar los dólares y el Estado le va a decir, me los tenés que vender obligatoriamente a mí a la mitad del valor que tienen en el mercado. Bueno, al final ese exportador se quedó de los 100 con 300, con suerte. Perdón, con 30 de los 100. Entonces, es una locura. Entonces, coincido con tu pregunta, son muy necesarias las políticas públicas. El problema es, ¿qué quiero lograr con esas políticas públicas? Porque bueno, a ver, estas, que yo les digo, esta carga tributaria excesiva, el régimen de cambios obligatorio y otras prácticas que tiene el gobierno, no dejan de ser política pública. Con la excusa de que, bueno, no, estamos mal, tenemos déficit, la balanza, está bien, pero si usted sigue haciendo desaguisados todos los días, sigue gastando lo que no tiene, dice que nacionaliza una empresa que le va a salir gratis, y después resulta que tiene un juicio de 14.000 millones de dólares, entonces uno dice, a ver, primero pongámonos de acuerdo, y una vez que estemos de acuerdo, hacemos las políticas para ver, pues yo decía, ¿a dónde queremos llegar? Y ahí, y me sumo a esto de la sinergia, acá en Argentina, por ejemplo, mucho tiempo existió, sí, yo creo que sigue existiendo, pero con un perfil tan bajo que hoy uno dice, era la Fundación Exportar, que le daba mucho soporte, sobre todo a estas empresas más pequeñas, porque las empresas grandes no lo necesitan, pero el exportador pequeño sí lo necesita. Entonces, yo creo que es necesario, es indispensable, pero hay que tener en claro qué se quiere lograr.
Una pregunta.
O comentarios puede ser también, ¿no? Porque nos pueden contar alguna experiencia de algún otro.
Ahí
Yo
primero.
quería hablar como abogado, sus colegas. Yo creo que hay falta de conocimiento del funcionario público que tiene a cargo la misión que va a cumplir y un componente ideológico radicalizado, donde se hace hincapié en la escasez y no en la posibilidad de ampliar los mercados para poder nuestra riqueza, porque Argentina tiene el 10% de los recursos vitales mundiales, sí, es un dato estratégico, la octava geografía del planeta, una extensión enorme y tiene lo que se necesita para vivir en el planeta el 10%. Es imposible que falten dólares, peor no se puede hacer las cosas. Entonces yo creo que no se respeta el derecho de propiedad, no hay libertad, y entonces se combina ideología, falta de conocimiento de la función, desconocimiento de la Constitución Nacional Argentina, donde las declaraciones, derechos y garantías serán reglamentadas para un mejor ejercicio en forma amplia y nunca restrictiva. O sea, desconocen absolutamente el derecho, pero ocupan función. Entonces, arruinan, yo decía, hasta la Coca-Cola en el 6 meses. Entonces, ese creo que sería el problema, la realidad que tenemos con la falta de dólares. No sé si esto es pregunta, comentario, pero si viene al caso para poder...
No, está bien, y me hace recordar dos experiencias. A uno no le gusta ser autorreferencial, pero bueno, me trae solamente dos recuerdos. Uno, crisis 2002, ponen derechos de exportación. Fue una discusión sobre, porque también había normas cambiarias, por una empresa tenemos que ir al Ministerio de Economía, habíamos pedido una entrevista con el ministro, en ese momento nos recibió el viceministro, y le decimos, mire, esto y esto es inconstitucional, un poco leyendo lo que vos decís, va en contra de la Constitución. Y él me dijo, mire doctor, yo le voy a ser sincero, usted tiene razón, pero yo le voy a cobrar hoy, usted haga el juicio y lo va a devolver otra administración dentro de 10 años. O sea, él se sacaba el problema encima, él cobraba igual, sabiendo que era inconstitucional, sabiendo que violaba la norma, sabiendo que... pero bueno, era su solución al problema. Él resolvía su problema y le pateaba el problema al ciudadano.
Pero incumple la ley,
Totalmente.
comete el delito de incumplimiento, los deberes funcionarios públicos.
Sí, sí, pero bueno, uno nunca llega a tanto porque pasan los años. El otro tema, y que me hiciste recordar también una anécdota, pero ya de hace muchos años, así que después un tocado porque me escribió. Yo decía que en el año 96 me había tocado ser representante de la Organización Mundial de Aduanas, y me acuerdo que termina una de las sesiones del Comité de Fraude Comercial y habían hecho un ofrecimiento para hacer entrenamiento para los funcionarios de otras aduanas. Entonces yo no tenía instrucciones especiales, pero inmediatamente fui a ver por teléfono, llamé por teléfono, dígame, ¿qué hacemos? Nada, doctor, usted no haga nada. Y yo digo, pero nadie estaba enterado de esto. hubiese tomado alguna decisión antes. Dice, no, porque está poco tiempo, usted del diario mire, tengo que decir sí o no mañana. Bueno, no, déjenlo, que yo digo, pero se pierden oportunidades así. Entonces, después averiguo, le digo, escúcheme, esto, la organización, ¿lo hizo saber antes? Entonces dice, sí, nosotros lo hicimos saber, las notificaciones las dejamos y tienen un lugar como si fuera un lugar de esto de correo, donde van poniendo cartas. Sobre todo en países europeos, uno levanta la puertita y yo me fui a ver ahí. Bueno, yo no les puedo decir, pero esto hablaría mal de nuestra Cancillería y de nuestra embajada, por eso digo, prescribió. La pila de cartas que había ahí sin leer era insólita. Entonces, a veces uno tiene que hacerse mea culpa, decir, hay alguien que no está haciendo lo que debería hacer. Que es tan simple como ir ahí a buscar las cartas. Ahora ya no habrá más cartas, y llegará todo por internet mucho más fácil. Pero bueno, esto que vos decís, bueno, a veces no hay instrucciones, o a veces esto puede pasar. Mentiramente. Bien lamentable.
A mí me gustaría preguntarle a Brian,
Quisiera preguntar, ¿podría describir el papel de la ANCHA?
¿Cómo no?
¿Cómo funciona?
Bueno, la ANCHA en realidad ha crecido mucho en los últimos tiempos y cambió mucho. Incluso desde cuando yo empecé a asistir, yo empiezo a ir a la ANCHA en 1996. Yo estaba en ese momento en PwC.
En cuenta, a lo mejor tenemos que explicar qué es ANCHA.
Es la American Chamber of Commerce en Argentina. Claro, perdón, la Cámara de Comercio de los Estados Unidos en Argentina, que es distinto a otras cámaras de comercio. Esto yo lo aprendí con el tiempo, porque en realidad no es una cámara de comercio bilateral como puede ser la Cámara holandesa argentina o alemana. No, esta es la Cámara de Comercio de los Estados Unidos en la Argentina. Es distinto. Yo con las palabras soy bastante denso. Uno tiene que leer bien, ¿no? Es distinto, no es lo mismo. Entonces, esa Cámara históricamente sí daba mucho soporte a las empresas americanas, pero es cierto que, como Argentina había tenido mucha inversión norteamericana, tenía muchas empresas americanas, que hoy las sigue teniendo, pero, digamos, ¿en qué cambió? Cambió en varios aspectos. Cuando yo empecé a ir, en 1995 más o menos, todavía se jugaba el torneo de golf de la ANCHA y participaban los CEO, los presidentes de las compañías americanas y demás. Luego se empezó a abrir y hoy tiene un componente grande también de empresas locales, ¿no? Porque la idea es que hay un flujo de comercio de ida y de vuelta. Entonces, no solamente está enfocada a empresas americanas propiamente dicho, sino que también a empresas locales. De hecho, cuando yo me voy de Price, mi estudio hoy, que es un estudio local, es miembro de ANCHA. O sea que ahí todos reciben servicios. Dentro de los servicios de ANCHA, originalmente la estructura era bastante más sencilla que la que es hoy. Y lo que había eran distintos comités. El comité más importante era el de Comercio Internacional. ¿Por qué? Porque, bueno, se suponía que era una cámara de comercio, entonces la parte de comercio era muy importante. Y otro que era muy importante era el de Tax and Legal, el de impuestos ilegales. La cámara se ayornó con los tiempos y la verdad que cumple un montón de funciones adicionales. Hoy tiene comités de sustentabilidad, tiene comités de medio ambiente, tiene comités de real estate, organiza el foro de salud. Realmente tiene una actividad impresionante. Los intercambios que ustedes deben saber con los Estados Unidos, donde van funcionarios, vuelven funcionarios, jueces. Hay una actividad muy interesante e importante de la Cámara. Y en lo que atañe al Comité de Comercio Internacional sigue existiendo, a mí me toca ser de autoridad del Comité de Comercio, acá el Comité de Comercio Internacional, de la sede de Buenos Aires, porque también después ANCHA, como fue creciendo, abrió una sede en Córdoba, en la provincia de Córdoba, y también tiene un Comité de Comercio Internacional en Córdoba. Ese Comité de Comercio Internacional también lo que hace es tener una reunión mensual, a menos que se necesite una reunión un tiempo más breve, a veces cuando salen estas normas explosivas del Banco Central y hay que entender las normas. Y la idea es, uno, normalmente viene algún funcionario, en las épocas que los funcionarios vienen, a hablar y a exponer un tema. Puede venir el director de aduanas, puede venir alguien de la Secretaría de Comercio, puede venir alguien de Cancillería, hablamos del Mercosur y demás. Y después se discuten los temas de coyuntura. Esto es, ¿qué pasa con las normas del Banco Central? ¿Qué pasa con el tema de licencias? Se cuentan experiencias, se ven potenciales soluciones y a veces incluso otros socios, a veces también teniendo sesiones conjuntas entre el Comité de Tax and Legal, porque a veces los temas son transversales, son temas de impuestos o temas de normas, a veces nos juntan el Comité de Comercio Internacional con el de Tax and Legal y hacemos una única sesión en conjunto para tratar de darle respuesta o soluciones a los socios del programa.
Tres cuestiones, Brian. La primera que está en
Sí, está.
o sea, hasta aquí. Y la segunda, creo que el mejor indicador del éxito de la AmCham es que ha ido creciendo en miembros que no son empresas estadounidenses,
Correcto.
sino que son empresas de origen. Tal vez eso.
Sí. Es un muy buen indicador y yo creo que la gente está conforme. Uno ve los socios, la respuesta realmente es sí.
Perfecto. Entonces, Brian Ver, para presentarlo a Denis Heck, simplemente le anuncio a todos, tenemos aquí presente a Beatriz Nofal, que nos va a acompañar también. Muchísimas gracias, Beatriz, por estar aquí. Después la presentamos.
Gracias, gracias.
Besita, adelante.
Sí, y solo, Ivana, por favor, traduzca para mi compañero Denis Heck y otros también. I am delighted. I'll proceed in English because I'm introducing a very dear friend and a very impressive individual. Denis Heck has held multiple roles in the government. He was a state legislator, and he served as the chief of staff for one of our more distinguished governors. He served in the United States Congress. He was in that role, and in addition to his role in Congress, he was director of recruitment for the Democratic Party to identify new candidates, an incredibly important role, which caused him to travel the entire country. As you know, it's a big country. He is now our lieutenant governor, which puts him in charge of the Washington State Senate. And in theory, at least, he would be second in line to the governor should something happen to him. Denny, in addition to his many roles in government, is also a successful entrepreneur, started several businesses and grown them to substantial size. In addition, he was the founder of our state level television, which provides television coverage of hearings and votes in the legislature. He, on top of that, is an incredibly modest, kind, hardworking, principled person. And he's written a wonderful book called Sausage. And the reason it's called Sausage, some of you know perhaps that the story about politics and how laws are made in the United States is it's a little bit like sausage. You don't want to know what goes into it. And if you read that book, what's remarkable about it to me is that it's not just a story of the legislative process as an abstract endeavor. It's a personal story of a human being, an individual wanting to make a difference, encountering many obstacles, still believing in the system, but seeing how it could be done better. So Denny is one of my people I most admire, who serves in our delegation from Washington State, and we are very lucky to have him here. He's got a very busy schedule. Denny, I don't see your image up there, but it'll come up soon, I'm sure, when we do the speaker image. So please welcome my dear friend and colleague, Denny Heck. Oh, there you are, Denny. I see you on the screen now.
Well,
Thank you, Brian. Do you want me to get started, Brian? Oops, you muted yourself and walked off. I start, Brian walks off. What does that tell you?
I'm just changing the screen. Explain that to Denny if you will.
Okay. Do you want me to start, Brian?
Yes, please, Denny.
go ahead.
Okay. I had you muted. I was doing a couple things here, so I'm sorry I missed my cue. It is an honor to be here. Thank you very much, Brian, for inviting me to be with this obviously incredibly prestigious group. I thought I would begin by explaining a little bit about my job, because in 50 years of intermittent public service, I've never encountered a position about which there was more misunderstanding than the job I hold. Now, you all know that the United States has a federal system, federal government, state government, local government. And at the state government level, we are, of course, divided into executive, legislative, and judicial. The lieutenant governor job that I now have is very bizarre because it's a little bit in the executive branch and it's a little bit in the legislative branch. Most people think that because of the title, I'm the deputy governor, and that's not true. I run independently from the governor, or they think I'm a legislator. So they always ask me, will you introduce a bill, or will you vote for or against something they care about? Lieutenant governors don't vote unless there is a tie. So it begs the question about what is this job? First of all, it's a really cheap insurance policy in case the governor gets hit by a bus. What I mean, of course, is that according to our Constitution, if our governor is incapacitated, I become the acting governor. Indeed, when our governor is out of our state in Washington, D.C., or California, or New York, I am the acting governor. Secondly, the lieutenant governor is the president of the Senate. I preside over the deliberations of our Senate. We, of course, have a House and a Senate. And that means I get to call on people. It means I get to enforce the parliamentary rules. And thirdly, other duties as assigned. I don't know that there's a job in the history of the world that didn't have other duties as assigned. I will give you an example. According to law in our state, I chair something called the Legislative Committee on Economic Development and International Relations. It draws equal numbers of members from both the House and the Senate and of our two major political parties. In that capacity, because of the international relations component, I regularly meet with the Consular Corps or the Consular Association. In other words, all of the nations that have foreign service officers that have either a presence in our largest city of Seattle or even on the West Coast. They're generally called consul generals. And in fact, just next week, I will be at the reception of all the consul generals in our state. Since I've taken office, which was not even quite 3 years ago, I have met one-on-one with more than 40 consul generals and ambassadors. This is a pretty big part of my job, but it's ceremonial. There's not a lot of concrete action that actually gets transacted. However, sometimes I am engaged in either diplomatic or trade missions. Just a couple of weeks ago, I got back from a week-long trade mission in Taiwan. And week after next, I am going to Mexico with a larger group of people. Trade's a big deal in Washington State, where I live. In fact, my state has the most trade-driven economy of all 50 states in America. We sell a lot of products and we buy a lot of products. And there's a reason why we're the most trade-driven. To begin with, we have a lot of natural deep water ports, most notably the port of Seattle or Tacoma. They are actually now in partnership with one another. We also are more proximate to the largest markets in the world, namely Asia. For example, by shipping time, something shipped out of the port of Seaport or SeaTac would arrive in Taiwan 2 days faster than anything else, than something shipped out of anywhere else on the west coast of the United States. That just has to do with the goofy curvature of the earth, as a matter of fact. The largest trading partner of Washington State is Canada, our neighbor to the north, with whom we share a 5,525-mile international boundary between America and Canada, and a 437-mile boundary between Washington State and Canada. Canada was not always our largest trading partner. For many years after China's admission, the PRC, the People's Republic of China, mainland China, after its admission to the World Trade Organization, they were our largest trading partner. But things have kind of cooled there now, as you may have noticed. Asian trade with Asia for our state in Washington is greater by dollar volume than all the other regions of the world combined. South America, Europe, Africa, all of them combined are not as big as our trade with Asia. Part of the reason why Washington State is such a trade-driven economy is because we sell a lot of stuff. We build airplanes for the Boeing company. If you've flown, there's at least a 50-50 chance you've flown on a Boeing airplane, because that's about the approximate percent of the worldwide market they have. And these are very expensive items. They're $250 million each. So it doesn't take very many of those for your trade numbers to get pretty big. But we also have an enormous agricultural industry on the east side of our state. We're our nation's leading producer of apples and cherries and all manner of other products. Now, generally speaking, trade is a federal issue up at the Washington, D.C. level. But the fact is, even though that's where trade agreements are negotiated and that's where tariffs are set, there's an enormous amount at the state level that impacts trade. Ports are local government operations regulated by the state. The roads into ports are supported by state government. So the state does have a role to play. I was also involved in trade when I had the honor to serve in the United States Congress for 8 years, and primarily in the form of being the U.S. House of Representatives leading advocate of something called the Export-Import Bank. It's known as an export credit authority. Most developed nations have them. Their goal basically is to support domestic jobs through enabling other countries to buy those goods. And what the bank does is either make direct loans for the purchase of American-made goods or loan guarantees for the purchase of American-made goods. Again, every developed nation in the world that I am aware of has an export credit authority. Ours, which is 90 years old, is relatively small, as a matter of fact. Export credit authorities generally, but specifically the Export-Import Bank in the United States, really exist to meet the needs where the market has failed. And the market fails with respect to selling products to foreign countries in 3 ways. Number one, if the product is really small and inexpensive, it's very hard for a bank to get a return on their money if they are financing the sale of low-cost items. So, for example, in Washington State, we have a company that makes music stands, and they're a low-cost item. And banks won't finance the purchase of those music stands, even when there are large amounts of them, because it's just not enough money. So low-cost products. Number two, sometimes very big, expensive, long-lived capital items. I already mentioned one, airplanes. Sometimes banks don't want that much concentration of risk on a limited number of transactions. And so the Export-Import Bank can step in. Or thirdly, sometimes the bank will finance products being purchased by developing nations where maybe they're not entirely stable. And banks will be worried about their ability to collect if there is a default. So that's where export credit authorities, and ours in particular, steps in. It's been very controversial. In our federal system, sometimes the laws are set to automatically expire, and you have to reenact the law. We had to do that for the Export-Import Bank when I was in Congress in both 2015 and 2019. I'm confused. I'm hearing a lot of noise, Brian.
Yeah, if someone had their mic on, then
Bien,
we'll-
sí, Estanislao de Dabonis, por favor.
Okay, so those were big fights in the United States Congress. And interestingly enough, they weren't necessarily partisan fights. It seems as though the extremes on both the left and the right didn't much like the bank at different times in its history. So I want to conclude by making a few observations about trade. First of all, it's inevitable. It's going to happen. It has always happened. In fact, this last weekend, my wife and I started watching a streaming TV series about Marco Polo, whose purpose was to open up trade routes between Italy along the Silk Road to China. And that was almost 1,000 years ago. It was 800 years ago. Trade is inevitable. People will always seek markets to sell their goods, regardless of political boundaries. Number two, if trade is done right, and that's not a small if trade is done right, it holds forth the prospect of increasing the standard of living of those involved on both sides of the transaction. Why? In market terms, it's simply a more efficient way to allocate capital and production. And of course, a more efficient production provides for increased opportunity. But that's the net effect. Notice I said the net effect is positive, but when it suddenly becomes cheaper to manufacture elsewhere, then that sector of the economy is obviously going to take a hit. America experienced this when we began buying much of our manufacturing goods from China. Well, guess what? China is now experiencing this as manufacturing has gone offshore to places like Vietnam. And anytime that happens, there are people behind who get hurt. There's a whole region of America that some would characterize as having been hollowed out by the decline of manufacturing in America. We don't do a very good job in America of mitigating the harm that comes as a consequence of these kinds of increased trading activity. But we keep trying. You know, I want to stop there and see if I've said anything that might cause somebody to want to make a comment or ask a question. Otherwise, I'll just talk at you for the entire hour.
Well, let me start. Denny, it's so wonderful to see you, my friend. It really, truly is. You've got to come visit Argentina. It's a magnificent country with great people and a very interesting time. Denny, you and I were both Democrats. And one of the things about a Democrat in the state in the US is that much of your political base comes from organized labor, oftentimes. Organized labor often was concerned about the loss of jobs due to trade. So Denny had a remarkable position. He recognized the importance of trade for our country and especially for our state, but part of his political base was anti-trade in some ways. So Denny, can you share what that experience was like, trying to do something that from policy ground was actually good, at least I agree with your position, but that was maybe politically difficult and had such high stakes, but not a lot of high rewards. The average citizen doesn't walk around saying, I'm going to vote for Denny Heck because he supports the XM Bank. Well, it would have been a good reason, but it wasn't political. Can you talk about the politics of supporting the XM Bank and other trade issues?
Well, overall, for a Democrat, the politics of trade can be hell. You're really caught between the rock and the hard pan. And the reality is, however, I think, Brian, and I think you would agree, that having a nuanced position on any kind of a high profile is likely to put you in that same spot. We are simply, in our country, unfortunately, living in an age where most issues are either black or white, and never the twain shall meet. There are no shades of gray in public policy debate in our country at the present time. All the incentives for behavior on the part of the politicians is, frankly, to go hard one way or hard the other way. And as most of you probably know, well, I don't know that it's true in Argentina. In the United States, the truth is that the average person, if there is such a thing, understands that there are shades of gray for things, but those aren't the loudest voices that tend to dominate our political debates. And so it can be uncomfortable and difficult. And you're right, there was very precious little political capital to be gained for me in being the leading advocate of the XM. But it A, gave me something to talk about, B, that I was successful at because we won, C, rather than say Export-Import Bank over and over, I said jobs over and over, and that is popular. So are there ways to navigate it? But you're right. I doubt I got a single vote because I was the XM guy.
Denny,
Dario has his hand.
Before we move to another question, can you give us just a little context? Because my memory is that when you stepped in, if I remember, the Republicans were trying to zero out the XM Bank, cut off all funding for it. Can you talk a little bit about the politics of that? Then we'll open it up more broadly, because I think it's telling. It's kind of a libertarian thing. We'll just not interfere with the free market, or we won't have any support for trade. Can you talk about that a little bit?
That's precisely correct. Although before I say more about it, I want to make sure I'm clear that over a long period of time, both the far left and the far right have been opposed to the Export-Import Bank. In 2015, when I first advocated for reauthorization of the Export-Import Bank, Brian, you'll appreciate this. There was a column early in the deliberation that came out, written by Robert Reich, who was the Secretary of Labor under President Clinton and quite liberal. And he just beat the daylights out of us and all those that advocated for the Export-Import Bank because he said it was corporate welfare. An interesting thing happened that really reveals a lot about, unfortunately, politics in America today. The far right mobilized quickly and loudly, including the chair of the committee that I served on that was deliberating on the Export-Import Bank. And I firmly believe because the far right came out against it, the far left shut up. And Robert never wrote another column or said a peep in opposition to the XM. So it's a position that seems to get traded back and forth between the two extremes. For the time being, we're good for a couple, 3 more years, and then we have another reauthorization effort. I will probably be involved in it because after I left Congress, I was appointed to the advisory board to the Export-Import Bank, which I think I'm vice chair of actually, but it's not an elected position. Former United States Senator Heidi Heitkamp is the chair, and she once called me vice chair in committee. And afterwards, I called her up and I said, Heidi, I don't remember there being an election. Why did you call me vice chair? Did I miss something? And she said, the vice chair, Denny, is whoever I say it is.
Denny, I mentioned when I first introduced you your motto that it's so hard to appreciate the sophisticated and delicate politics that you have to do if the chairman of your committee, who controls pretty much everything, is against something that you're for. And you're in the minority part, right, by definition. So for Denny to start with a significant mobilization against this Export-Import Bank, with the former president's labor secretary against it, with unions against it, and with his chairman against it, and prevail, is really a remarkable thing, Denny, and I congratulate you. With that, let me know.
Actually, the unions were in favor of it.
Oh, is that right?
Domestic content requirement, and they were important allies. But interestingly, Brian, you will recall we won that battle because for the first time in almost 20 years, we successfully used a tool called a discharge petition, which basically meant the floor of the House took over the decision-making process. It doesn't happen, but we knew we had the votes. It was just this tiny minority of very conservative libertarians that held the key position that could block us.
That's extremely rare in the normal rules of the House. The chair of the committee works with the Speaker of the House, and they decide what bills will come to the floor or not come to the floor. Yep. But there is a mechanism whereby if you get more than a majority of people to sign what's called a discharge petition, you can require that the bill comes up for a vote. But it's very rare because you have to, if you're in the majority party, you're basically voting against the decision of your chairman to not bring it up for the vote. So then he had to marshal the forces of both sides, Democrats and Republicans, because trade's so important. He could say, your state has this. And I'm sure, Denny, you went and did the rounds talking to each representative and individually and saying, this is how the Ex-Im Bank helps your state. I'm guessing that was the process.
I had a piece of paper for every congressional district in America showing what job creation had been caused by Ex-Im activity in their district.
435 pieces of paper.
I worked very hard.
Yes. Other questions? One.
Yes, Lieutenant Governor Tech, thank you very much for being here and for your words. Me gustaría ahora escuchar las reflexiones de Beatriz Nofal, es ex Sherpa del G20, ha sido Sherpa del G20 y secretaria de la República Argentina y además preside el Comité de los Estados Unidos de América del think tank más importante de la Argentina y tal vez de Latinoamérica, que es el Consejo Argentino para las Relaciones Internacionales. Tal vez, Beatriz, por favor, unas reflexiones tuyas.
Sí.
Are you getting the translation okay, Denny?
More or less.
I didn't hear the first part.
Can you say
Oh,
it again?
yes, of course. I want to introduce you to Beatriz Nofal, who is a former Sherpa of G20 in Argentina and Secretary of Argentina, of the Argentine nation. She is the chairwoman of the Committee on the United States of America, at a think tank, probably the best known in Latin America, and of course in Argentina, is the Consejo Argentino para las Relaciones Internacionales. She's going to talk about your presentation and to share some thoughts with us.
Yes, okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to everybody. Thank you, Denny, for your wonderful presentation. I've also have been Sherpa, not only Sherpa, I've been Congresswoman, and I also was in the Secretary of Trade, of Industry and Trade in Argentina. In fact, I started the whole integration process between Argentina and Brazil. After coming right back from MIT, when I finished my PhD at Johns Hopkins University, I applied for a faculty position at MIT. I got in, was the third women economist appointed at MIT in 1975. And I'm telling this because I met Robert Reich. I was in a joint appointment with Harvard, and I was present when Michael Porter did the first study on American competitiveness, and he presented the study in Harvard. So they invited me to the presentation. Robert Reich was there. Also, Raymond Vernon was still alive and was there, the author of the growth cycle theory. And there were representatives, members from the House of Representatives from Washington there. And Michael Porter explained what problems America, because the problem of American competitiveness was already discussed, that the industrialization of America was already discussed. Benedict Harrison had a book then in 1975. And there was one of the representatives from Washington, after they explained that a large percentage of PhD graduates from US universities, they're coming from Asia.
Sorry.
We're coming from Asia. So one of the representatives said, well, couldn't we regulate this so we don't have, and Ray Vernon, I remember saying, no, the knowledge doesn't have borders. You have to let the knowledge free flow across borders and across frontiers. So well, going to your presentation, I really, congratulations for saving the Export-Import Bank. Argentina had a National Development Bank also, but we closed it in, I think it was in 1990 or 1991. Yes, which, for instance, put us at a competitive disadvantage with Brazil. Brazil has a development bank, and they do export financing. We don't have export financing, particularly for capital goods, and Argentina has some. So yes, we're at a disadvantage. But congratulations. I'm going to make some comments on international cooperation, particularly the WTO, that I like your reflection. But before that, just one comment regarding the hollowing out pattern in employment. Well, there's been a debate, an academic debate, regarding which are the main factors that have led to this hollowing out, meaning that particularly middle jobs, both white collar and blue collar, had disappeared, while high-skilled jobs have increased, and also a lot of service jobs have low skill have increased as well. In some sectors, like textiles, yes, trade has been a factor, but in other sectors, it's not clear that trade is the dominant factor. Technology, automation, it's a main factor, or at least that's what some studies prove. And that's why it's so important to put the emphasis on retraining, so that people that get displaced because the tasks get automated could really re-enter the more sophisticated jobs. So your view, because in Boeing, for instance, Boeing, I assume there is a lot of automation. So how would Boeing address the issue of automation and hollowing out? So that's one question regarding your comment. I really, regarding the Exim Bank story, I congratulate you. I think it's very important. If you want to export complex goods, you need an export-import bank. There's no other way to do it and compete in the global economy. Particularly China also uses finance as an arm to penetrate foreign markets. No, well, let me say something about international cooperation. The trade has been, like you said, a driver of growth, prosperity, and peace. But although that has been recognized in the second half of the contribution of trade in the second half of the 20th century, in the first, since I will say in the 21st century, there are a lot of questions regarding whether economic interdependence is not being used by some countries as an arm. Particularly this view against economic interdependencies came after not only the financial crisis, but particularly the pandemia, the COVID pandemia that led to problems in the supply chains, and the invasion of Russia and Ukraine, and also the problems, for instance, in Europe dependency on gas from Russia. So now the trade is being tensioned. International trade, the US play a very important role in the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs first, and then in the constitution of the WTO. But these multilateral rules now are being tensioned by geopolitical factors. So that's a very important source of tension because of national security reasons. The United States and Europe and other countries are implementing restrictions to export and restrictions to imports. And also the climate, the challenges we have with the climate crisis and the climate transition are also leading to a tension in the trade rules we design and we agree at the WTO, particularly because there is again, to facilitate the green transition, new subsidies are being implemented both in the United States and Europe. And these subsidies, some question and say that they are not, they don't comply with the subsidies agreement we signed at the WTO. Of course, there has been, since China acceded the WTO, China has been an outlier. But this, I mean, the developed countries have a responsibility because China, while Latin America, for instance, we had our hands tied regarding industrial policy subsidies, China didn't. And nobody said anything because the most important thing was accessing the big market China had. But we couldn't because if we implemented subsidies, we will face immediate retaliation and compensatory duties or anti-dumping duties, although they're not the same. So right now, we're seeing both in the IMF report and the recent WTO report, they're speaking of the risk of fragmentation. If you look at for instance, the percentage of intermediate inputs being traded in bilateral US relation with China, with Asia, you will see a certain decrease. It's not clear whether it's because of geopolitical factors or because of economic reasons, maybe the slowdown in China. It's not clear, but what most experts think that there is a plateau in terms of increasing trading in global value chains. And then there is a speak of in order to provide greater resiliencies, we're talking about reshoring. Reshoring, it's one cause of fragmentation of global value chains. We're speaking of nearshoring. For instance, Mexico has benefited in Latin America enormously of nearshoring of manufacturing activity. And friendshoring, which is, establishing new investment for manufacturing in countries that are politically aligned. South America, we're not part of the geopolitical problem. We are far away from the geopolitical problem, but we're far away from the markets. So if we're going to deliver on the President Biden call for an alliance for prosperity in South America, we need to agree on new investments that are aligned with the US priorities. Otherwise, the industrial policy in the US is going to lead to a deviation of investment and concentration of investment in the United States. So this is a complex world. We need a WTO strong and adapted to new times. The next ministerial WTO conference is going to be in February in Abu Dhabi. We need to resolve these new problems, also all problems. The agricultural agreement, which we signed in 1995, was never fully implemented. Still, domestic subsidies are important both in the United States and in Europe. There is no limit, there are no multilateral rules. on this. The WTO did agree on limit to export subsidies. This for countries, for South America is very important because we could develop, I mean, at a moment where there is food security problems in the world, South America can be a good provider of food to the world, and we can integrate in global food value chains. But for that, we need multilateral rules that discipline effective tariffs and discipline domestic subsidies. Now there is a new discussion going on, at least in the WTO. For years, this was not talked or negotiated. So it will be very important, the collaboration. When I was Sherpa, G20 Sherpa, I remember talking, it was when President Trump was in the United States. And I remember trying to convince them to start negotiations when we were talking about agricultural reforms, that agriculture was part of the deal. And I said, listen, we're not going to be providing, flooding the markets, the US market, the European markets with food. The main importer in the world are where we want to export, but with transparency and with open markets to China. And we need, in order to discipline China, we need multilateral rules. We're not going to do it with a bilateral free trade agreement. Australia didn't do it. Australia signed a free trade agreement with China and couldn't get rid of the tremendous barriers China had. So we need to cooperate. We need the US really to help us address these challenges and also to solve the issue of the appellate body. That's a little bit complex technically. We need US leadership. I know that the US is going, like you said, in a process of political confrontation, polarization, no? That sometimes makes you to look inward, no, to solve. But we need US, I mean, the world, and now, and my solidarity to Israel because of the terrorists, I repudiate the terrorist attack. But we're in a very complex world, and we need to yes.
I'm wondering if we can invite Danny to talk about it.
So I'm finished, but we need US cooperation on international, on strengthen the multilateral trade system.
Danny, can you comment on the multilateral trade system and especially relations with China? Because Washington's traditionally had a great deal of trade with China. And obviously, an expert such as we just heard from knows this stuff brilliantly. What's your experience been in Washington State?
Well, as I indicated, the People's Republic of China was our far and away largest trading partner for Washington State for many years until the cool set in during the Trump years. But they're still second or third, I believe. They're a very large trading partner still. Look, trade is hard. Trade is really hard. The doctor called it complex, and that it is, but it is hard. On the one hand, we have very deep-seated different world perspectives and values than the People's Republic of China. On the other hand, short of a shooting war, it doesn't make sense not to try to constructively engage one another. But it's not easy, and it's never going to be easy. Personally, to be real direct about this, I think the United States made a mistake in agreeing to the admission of PRC into the WTO, the World Trade Organization, without better means of enforcing a rule-based approach to trade. The reality is, and it's very well documented, that the PRC steals intellectual property all the time. All the time. You can't have a well-functioning market in the absence of rules. And we simply don't have much of a means for ensuring that they will adopt a different approach. The hope at the time, which has not been proven to have been a realistic one, is that they would become a more liberal economy with their admission into the WTO and a much larger scale of global trading. But they, in many ways, they simply haven't. So the path forward, I think, and again, I'm not as much of an expert as you are, Doctor, but the path forward is we should continue to constructively engage them. But we should do so with, frankly, very clear eyes, with a very dispassionate and objective understanding of what their behavior has been in the past. Brian, was that responsive to?
And I want to put, you'll know this better than I, but I think you'll find this very interesting, Doctor. When I'm interested in how local agricultural interest, as one example, gets impacted by international geopolitics. So when President Trump made adversarial statements to China, and then he imposes tariffs, what are some of the examples you saw within our own state, any as farmers or small business people or whatever got caught in the middle of that?
Well, one of the things that the PRC will often do is, with respect to agricultural products or fish and meat or dairy products, all of a sudden come up with a charge that there's some health consideration, which isn't borne out by anybody. It's just a way to retaliate. So on multiple occasions, they would say, oh, your gooey ducks are no longer safe. And every lab in the world would be testing the gooey ducks and saying, what the heck are you talking about? They're fine, but they will do this. When I was in Taiwan, they gave me 2 instances where the PRC had done the same thing to them and just shut off trade all of a sudden. What's the name of that fish? The grouper? Wasn't it the grouper that they all of a sudden decided wasn't safe to eat? Well, there wasn't really any basis for that, but they will retaliate in that way. Not rule-based, pretend rule-based, but not rule-based. Now, this is not to say that a nation doesn't have a right to set health standards for the consumption of products by its citizens, but in the instances that I'm referring to, it was all fake and everybody knew it. So they will retaliate in that way.
Juan is going to call. We have some other questions, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Darío Polsky, de Cancillería Argentina. Adelante, por favor.
Thank you very much. First of all, I wanted to just thank everyone, all the speakers for their presentations and for taking the time. I should say that I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Nofal and the G20 team when she was Sherpa, so it's great to see her again. I wanted to ask the Lieutenant Governor Heck regarding some of the issues that Dr. Nofal mentioned. Some of the events that took place in recent years regarding supply chain disruptions and the trends on friendshoring and nearshoring. And if you could just, I'd love to know your views on how these trends and these events have, first of all, how they've impacted the state of Washington and the industry there, and perhaps even if you could comment more broadly on the U.S., but also what sort of support the friendshoring and nearshoring trends have politically from Democrats and from Republicans, considering their impact on job creation, on inflation as well. So, thank you.
So thank you for the question, sir. I'm not convinced that Washington State suffered any unique supply chain problems, unique as in different than other states, but we certainly did, and we continue to. When I was in Taiwan, we met with both their major airlines, both of whom purchased Boeing airplanes, both of whom love Boeing airplanes, both of whom complained loudly that they weren't receiving their ordered airplanes quickly enough, and that was a consequence of supply chain issues. What the Boeing company did now nearly a generation ago was decide to spread out its supply chain throughout the world as part of how it is that they would have a local presence and have a strengthened hand in order to sell their planes, their finished product. You know, is it Dario?
Yes.
Yes.
I surprise people sometimes when I tell them the truth. Boeing Airplane Company doesn't make airplanes. They don't. They assemble them.
Exactly.
And they assemble them with the parts, a lot of metal fabricators, but a lot of others, from 12 to 15,000 companies in their supply chain. So if there's going to be a supply chain disruption, you can bet that a company that has 12 to 15,000 companies in its supply chain is going to be affected. And so they were, but so was everybody. My wife and I were trying to buy a car last year and couldn't do it for the longest time because of the supply chain. The central, you know, I'm looking out this window. I want to see. Oh, I got the background up. I am in Seattle on the 27th floor, looking out at the Puget Sound at ship after ship after ship in the harbor that's anchored and getting ready to load or to unload. And it occurs to me that nothing could tell the story of our state more than the actual view that I have where I sit. The central part of our onshoring was probably the CHIPS Act to bring chip production home, which was done basically not just for the economy, but for national security reasons. And Dario, that was broadly supported in a bipartisan way. So that was popular. There's a question in the chat, and I'm going to get the question in the chat. What do you think about
question also? I have a question. Yes. Then you have a question regarding lithium or critical minerals. But Argentina is lithium is a very important export of us to the United States. And regarding I think in the Inflation Reduction Act, subsidies are to the automotive industry for the transition to electric vehicles are given to cars that integrate batteries that are made from materials either extracted and fully manufactured in North America or with countries that the United States has a free trade agreement. So I wonder whether Argentina will qualify because we don't have a free trade agreement with the United States.
We should get one.
Well, but Jay Sullivan said in a famous speech at Brookings when he announced the new industrial policy, transition policies, that free trade agreements are not now agreements are going to be of other kind, but they're not going to be about free trade. That he said at Brookings' famous speech. So they're not popular in Washington now. However, still my question is that, but however, just one sign of alert, if finally the US, the European Union Mercosur agreement gets implemented, there's going to be a lot of trade deviation to Europe against the United States.
Did you follow the question, Denny?
I need to be honest, even embarrassingly for myself. I'm terrible in understanding accents, and I apologize. But moreover, there is an echo to the doctor's mic that makes what is difficult for me to begin with even harder. So if somebody can help me.
Let me translate.
The question regarding the free, yes.
So Denny, the question was, Argentina has a lot of lithium. And the question was, in some of the recent the legislation promoting domestic manufacturing, especially of electric vehicles, has certain constraints on what would be eligible for tax credits based on the source of the materials, including the raw materials. And that creates a disadvantage for Argentina because they do not qualify as a free trade agreement state with the US, but nevertheless, they're a friendly democracy in the region. And if we don't trade with them, then conceivably they'll be trading through Mercosur with the EU. But it seems to me, I'm putting words in the doctor's mouth a little bit, but this is a disadvantage to a friendly country that is struggling economically. So is that?
Yes, perfect. That
Well,
Yeah, it has to export.
Let me just say, I'm not expert at that new federal law. I was not in Congress when it was adopted, but I can tell you this, we're not done with it. These things tend to pass in the United States Congress in a great big flurry, and they tend to be very long and complex. And in the process of implementation, concerns will be raised and people will say, well, we didn't mean to do that, or we didn't have in mind that unintended consequence. So I would confidently predict that provisions of the law will be revisited.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Other question one. Danny, we've only got you about 10 more minutes. I want to be respectful of your time.
I'm so sorry. We have a question here, Lieutenant Governor, about Taiwan, because you mentioned that you have visited Taiwan recently. So the question is,
Actually, sir, I have it I see it in the chat.
yeah, perfect. About the support of the US to Latin American countries related to Taiwan. There are just in Central America, Guatemala, with a close relationship with Taiwan, and Paraguay in South America. But the rest, the influence of China is very strong. So basically, that's the question.
So it's obvious that President Xi Jinping is putting the hardcore full court press, as we would say in America, putting a lot of pressure on countries to sever all relations with Taiwan. It's obvious that it's been successful. The number in the last, I can't remember how many years, 10 years, has been cut in half about. And as long as he is there, unless he has a change of heart, that pressure will continue. I don't know what the future holds for Taiwan. I have a favorite expression, and I don't know if it will translate well into Spanish, but it is this: when trying to be mindful of the dangers of predicting the future, I say, they who live by the crystal ball are condemned to eat glass. And I definitely think we could be eating some glass if we tried to make too many predictions about this. It is a perilous circumstance. I do think that we are in the midst, I believe, of a lot of democracies in the world beginning to understand that they need to stand together in support of these values, which I believe so deeply in as one person: the right to self-determination, the right to free, fair, and open elections conducted with integrity, guaranteed individual rights, the rule of law, where we are governed by law, all of us equally, not by the whims of an individual, and the peaceful transfer of power. These are the values that underpin democratic countries. And they need to understand that we need to stand together to uphold those values.
One last question, Denny, and then we'll wrap up. You've been fantastic with your time. Thank you.
Santiago Traini, por favor.
Hello, thank you. My question goes as, how dependent is the United States on their harbors as far as trade comes? And for example, let's say that workers on the harbors go on strike for 3 days. How much will the US be harmed on that aspect?
Brian, I heard how much will we be, how dependent are we on what?
Yeah, the question was about how important our harbors are.
Oh,
and
right.
It was, what would the effect of a longshore strike? Longshore,
Yeah.
the work
Great, Santiago, great question. It wouldn't take very long to cripple us. That's the fact of the matter. That's why longshoremen in this country make really, really, really good money. As a matter of fact. And of course, it would differ by region. But the truth of the matter is, we trade, we sell a lot, we export a lot, and we import a lot. And it is vital to our economy. In fact, when it looked as though the West Coast longshoremen might be headed for a protracted shutdown, the White House got involved in trying to encourage them in the strongest terms to avert a strike, and they did. So it would hurt us. Then again, I never cease to be amazed, Santiago, at how resilient our economy is to things. It just amazes me. The dip in our economy is something weird about here. The dip in our economy because of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, lasted about a minute and a half, and we bounced back, even though we shut the entire economy down for all practical purposes. So I say it would cripple us. It would hurt us a lot. It would especially hurt the state where I live, for sure.
Denny, I'm gonna finish with this question, and I know we don't have a lot of time. Part of the reason I was so gratified and excited to come down here is I just believe that we need to strengthen ties between the US and Latin America. And I have immense respect for the people of Argentina and the country going through difficult times, but good people. How can a state like Washington, with so much trade activities, begin to build relationships with Latin America in general, but with states like nations like Argentina, when so much of our national attention is focused on Ukraine, the Middle East today, or something else? How can we build those ties more strongly at the state to nation level, even if the nation to nation level is not as attentive?
We just have to work harder at it, Brian. And the way to make that happen is to find people for whom that might be an interest that are in key positions. I deeply share your perspective that America has not given enough attention to Latin America, not in the recent past, but for a very, very long period of time. And I frankly don't understand why that's the case, but it is the case. Especially when we're talking about functioning democracies. I mean, who's got too many friends, right? Nobody's got too many friends that share our values. So we got to work harder at it. Your being there is an incremental brick in that load. So good on you. I'm gonna speculate you're gonna bring back some enthusiasm for this.
I hope so, Danny. We have a delegation of former members of Congress next week. And next week's fairly yet, but the week after that, we'll have several members of Congress here to join us. Danny, my friend, sometimes people despair about politicians or say, well, they don't know what they're talking about. You've embodied the very best as a public servant your entire life, and you've manifested it again today. We're grateful for your time. I'm grateful for your time.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, my friend. I hope to see you again soon.
Be safe.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Bueno, tenemos una pregunta aquí entonces para Beatriz.
Hi everyone, I'm just gonna take some quick screenshots.
Oh,
Oh,
hello.
Lieutenant, are you still here?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, just wanna take some screenshots. If anyone in the Zoom wants to be in the screenshot, feel free to turn on their cameras, no pressure.
Cameras. Yeah. Oh, my wife's there. Say hi to my
Screenshot.
wife.
Okay, so
Screenshot.
3, 2, 1.
but she's in the United States.
No, she's here.
Oh, she's here.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Be well.
That's Danny's staff. All right. So I wanted to make sure that. Well, we're happy to take, we have another hour for questions. Do we need to take about a 5 or 10 minute break? One, I think, maybe.
Yes, perfect. Yeah.
Let's take about a 10-minute break and reconvene at 7:10 with both online and here in the room. Okay.
Sure, we don't have coffee for you over there, but tenemos a Pilar. Bueno, perfecto. Muchísimas gracias. Disculpas por el descanso. Brian, si te parece, antes de continuar, podemos hacer algunas reflexiones sobre lo que escuchamos hace un rato, tanto a Beatriz Nofal, como a Adrián Míguez, como a Denny Heck y al propio Brian BAIRD. Yo quería hacerle unas preguntas a ustedes, a todos los que están allí, y también a Brian, que está aquí a mi derecha. Va a ser más difícil para Brian contestarla, pero también puede hacerlo de su experiencia en los Estados Unidos de América, que tiene que ver con el rol del sector privado y no solo con el rol del sector público. Está claro, desde mi punto de vista, que la Argentina no tiene tradición de un sector público orientado a apoyar el desarrollo de las empresas, sobre todo a fomentar las exportaciones, la creación de empleo privado genuino. Eso está claro, tenemos una fuerza solo desde el punto de vista de los recursos humanos que supera los 3 y pico de millones de personas que están en el sector público consolidado, nacional, provincial, municipal. Y yo como parte también, y que tengo una fuerte experiencia también en el sector público, veo que excepto las áreas específicas que muchas veces generan más bien obstáculos a la producción que beneficios, que promueven. Aquí Adrián ha contado algunos casos muy claritos, muy claros, con respecto a las dificultades que tienen las compañías en la Argentina para desenvolverse de todo tipo, cosas realmente impensables. Pero no es solamente, no son solo las áreas específicas, sino que son también, no hay una cultura del sector público, y esta es un poco la pregunta donde la gente entienda, nosotros, me incluyo, todos entendamos que necesitamos compañías que generen empleo, que produzcan cosas, servicios, bienes, que vendan, que paguen impuestos, que contraten gente, que exporten, que inviertan en investigación y desarrollo, que creen nuevas tecnologías que sean competitivas en el mundo. Entonces yo creo que nosotros como país, una gran diferencia con los Estados Unidos, pero le quiero preguntar a Brian desde su cosmovisión, es que nosotros no tenemos una cultura pro sector privado en la Argentina. Es casi algo muy pequeño, está visto inclusive en forma peyorativa desde mi punto de vista. ¿Por qué ocurre eso? Sería una pregunta. Dos, si realmente los argentinos creemos que es un problema el sector privado, si tenemos un problema con las empresas, si tenemos un problema con el comercio, con la generación de valor sin intervención del Estado, con la mínima posible. Y antes de contestarnos nosotros, me gustaría escucharlos a ustedes, yo creo que sí es un grave problema cultural de Argentina, y no es solo de la política, no es solo de la política. Entonces, quisiera preguntarle también a Brian, ¿qué ocurre en los Estados Unidos? ¿Cómo es la cultura en general? Porque obviamente de distintas opiniones, etcétera, pero en general, como pueblo en los Estados Unidos, ¿cuál es la visión respecto al sector privado y de sus empresas?
Yeah. A great question, Juan. It varies, of course. Some people are very much anti. Some people are, there's tension between the left and the right a little bit. But in general, the idea that we have a free market system is fundamental to our country. It's very rare that you would have a person in elective office speaking against capitalism, speaking against the free market. That's rare. Maybe one or two members of the entire Congress, maybe, and even they moderate that. That doesn't mean we don't have to have regulation, because if you just let a company externalize its costs by polluting the water or the air or treating the workers poorly, etc. So we've tried to achieve a balance, and it's been a long process involving labor, organized labor, competing for basic rights, fair wages, safe work conditions, etc. But that tension has generally worked. I think the most important thing, I'll share an experience I had one. I served on the House Science Committee, and I was very interested in how we had done international surveys about what other people in other countries admired about the US. And in addition to democracy and freedom, which was very high, there was the technological, the technological ability of our country. You know, put men on the moon, create the internet. You know, it's pretty amazing. And there was admiration. So I was interested in, can we incorporate our technological and scientific abilities with our diplomatic efforts? You know, the science diplomacy, we call it. But I traveled around multiple places in the country, but I went to the Middle East at one point. And I expected that the answer might be, if I were to say, how can the United States build stronger ties diplomatically with our technology? That was the question. Oftentimes, as an American, when you travel, people say, we want money. We want foreign assistance. And if we have time, I'll look at some of that in today's class. But that's not what I heard. What I heard was very interesting in the Middle East. We want a meritocracy. So I talked to people who had attended the best universities in the US, best, MIT, Harvard, Stanford, etc. UW, University of Washington. And they said, look, in the US, it's a meritocracy in the scientific community. If you come up with an invention that's better than the other invention, you can take it to market, you can have rule of law protections for your patent, for your copyright, your intellectual property, and you can advance in a corporation and in the government if you have the talent. What many people said here they would say in the Middle East, I could have the best scientific finding, but if someone else's uncle is the head of the Science Association, that person will get the funding for their research, even if my research is better. So that issue of meritocracy and the ability to advance based on your abilities has always been fundamental. I'll give one other story. We have a major microchip manufacturing plant in my district, in my congressional district, a multi-billion-dollar, employed hundreds of people. The director of that plant came to America from Iran many years ago with $20 in his pocket. That was all he had. He knew no person. He had no family. He had no house. He had no job. He had $20. He walked around. He found a place where he could wash dishes. The point is, he now directed a multi-billion-dollar factory. That ability to, through hard work, dedication, and creativity, move it when we're at our best. Now, obviously, we've had discrimination based on gender, based on race, based on other things. But when we're at our best, that opportunity to start your own business, to build your own product is incredibly powerful and fundamental to the best of our country and the world, actually, in some ways.
Yo quiero aprovechar mientras no veo, ahí está, sí, Víctor, ahí le damos la palabra. Pero quisiera aprovechar una anécdota también que me sorprendió mucho, investigando cómo ha sido la historia de los ferrocarriles en los Estados Unidos, que tuvo un periodo, en el periodo de guerra, en el cual los ferrocarriles no fueron expropiados por el Estado, sino que pasaron a trabajar los mejores ejecutivos de la industria con los reguladores, etcétera, para ver cómo la industria ferroviaria podía aportar a la industria de guerra para que los Estados Unidos ganara, obviamente defendiendo los intereses nacionales. Entonces, eso también tiene mucho que ver, que es el principio de subsidiariedad. ¿Por qué nosotros en la Argentina? Yo creo que lo que sucede en la Argentina también, por eso hablo del sector privado, hay una cultura donde la propia política genera barreras de todo tipo, que son negocios, perdón lo que digo, me hago cargo. O sea, negocios no es necesariamente corrupción económica, sino de tendencia de factores con el poder político, y que hay una complacencia también, porque hay una forma de hacer negocios acostumbrada a una política que genera arbitrariedades, porque niveles de discrecionalidad muy altos, donde depende, se fortalece la decisión política. Entonces, creo que es mucho más profundo el problema en Argentina, no es solamente de los políticos, lo que lamentablemente es un poco generalizado, es de una opinión, la mayor responsabilidad está en la política, y yo eso en los Estados Unidos veo que casi, y acá la voy a preguntar, está considerado una traición a los Estados Unidos si uno tuviese un gobierno que va en contra de los intereses de sus empresas, de las exportaciones de los Estados Unidos. Un país que tiene a la seguridad nacional como un paraguas y donde el comercio, el ambiente, cualquier otra cosa va por abajo de la seguridad nacional. Con lo cual, no es gratuito que haya una generación política que vaya contra la capacidad, digamos, instalada en los Estados Unidos para generar empleo, exportar y generar valor. No, tal vez me equivoco.
No, I think it's important to understand that there's a balance between. Actually, I'm going to make it a little more complicated. There was a time, especially in World War II, where every American industry put everything it had into the war effort. You know, you took automobile plants, they became manufacturers of tanks. Boeing, the numbers of Boeing B-17s that were produced in that war, astonishing. The rate at which we were producing ships, airplanes, etc. And there was a sense that if you're an American company, you should focus on the well-being of your workforce, your community, and your nation. That has shifted, I'll be honest, that has shifted over recent years as multinational companies have said, we're going to go wherever the workforce is cheapest, wherever the regulations are weakest, wherever the taxes are most incentivizing. And that's part of why there's been a reaction anti-trade, back to our theme of the day, is because there is a sense that the exportation of the priority is no longer the workers, the community, or the nation. The sole priority is the stockholders and the executives who make $25 or $50 million or $100 million in a single year. And that's a real tension. As you know, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, but there is who, by the way, would be the first person to take advantage of everybody else. But he has somehow convinced the workforce that he's on their side. And I'll share with you a partisan perspective. It used to be that free trade was championed by the Republican Party. The idea, because they were the party of the Chamber of Commerce, essentially. They were the pro-business party. And it used to be that labor was very concerned about trade for fear of jobs being exported. But now, under the current Republicans, they're very anti-trade in many ways. So that's why Danny Heck, who we heard earlier, had to deal with anti-export-import bank from the libertarian side, that were saying, oh, this is taking American taxpayer dollars and exporting jobs. They were actually trying to export resources to create markets for products made by Americans, but that's not how it got interpreted. So it's not absolutely black or white. Then there are people. There's a branch of the Democratic Party that is a pro-trade, pro-business branch. They're called the New Democrats, and I was a member of that. But there's another branch of the Democratic Party that sees the abuses of some corporations and confronts that.
Excellent, thank you. Víctor.
Gracias, Juan de Dios. Realmente excelente lo que pones en mesa. Sin duda alguna, pues, que los países desarrollados ha habido una mala sinergia entre el empresariado y el sector público. Realmente creo que los estados de nuestros países, y perdón que generalice, han estado más concentrados en ver su política doméstica que impulsar políticas públicas, como le decía el profesor Miguel, que estuvo hoy platicando, y coincido con él, que no es una cuestión ideológica, no es una cuestión de intereses para el desarrollo y ver con visión de país el futuro de nuestras naciones. No obstante, también no solo es culpa del sector público, porque se ha alejado al empresario de ese sector público, pero también no ha habido una responsabilidad social empresarial. Entonces creo que hay que reflexionar en ejercer el Estado políticas públicas que tiendan a ese desarrollo y apoyen al sector privado para que pueda producir con esa responsabilidad social empresarial que hace falta, por lo menos en Guatemala. Hoy, no sé si ustedes han dado seguimiento a las noticias, estamos ya por más de 4 días en un paro nacional derivado al proceso electoral, y hoy es cuando los empresarios se dan cuenta cómo Guatemala y todo Guatemalteco están afectados por esa mala relación que existe entre lo económico, productivo y el sector político. Creo que es una gran reflexión, Juan de Dios. Muy buena reflexión la que pones en mesa para replantear cómo debe existir esa sinergia entre todas las élites o los sectores de una nación productiva.
Lo que ocurre en Guatemala y en muchos de otros países de América Latina. ¿Quieres desarrollar algo?
I'm sorry, but I'm a little hard of hearing, and so I wasn't able to pick just the tone of his voice.
No, he was saying.
Can you translate?
Yeah, he was saying basically, according to what we were talking about, how important are public policies and not just looking at the interior, to the domestic policy, but also internationally, and the relationship between the private sector and politics. So there is tension there. So he was saying that the same, that sometimes it's also a responsibility of the private sector. He was talking about the important to be sustainable, responsible from the corporations. And he was telling us about Guatemala, what is happening 4 years with problems in the country, strikes, if I'm not wrong, for years. Basically that.
Yes, let me share. It's a really important issue that you raised. Thank you for that. I'll give you a little bit of the background of our trade agreement policies and the politics of it. Under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress the authority to regulate commerce with other nations. But presidents negotiate treaties. And so what typically happens is the executive branch will send a trade negotiation team to the big trade meetings or bilateral trade meetings, negotiate an agreement, and then that agreement has to be approved by the Congress. For many years, there was an effort to give the president what was called fast track authority. So the president could unilaterally negotiate with another country and then come back to the Congress for a straight up or down vote. This was desired by presidents who like power. And it was generally when the Republican president was in charge, the Republicans wanted that to be part of trade agreements, that they wanted to give the president fast track authority. Democrats tended to say, no, we want as members of Congress to be able to exercise some input in this, which I believe is important. And here's why. If I represent a district that has a certain agricultural crop or a certain manufacturing product, I want to be able to have some input. I may not win, but I want to have some voice in that process. The other thing is, I don't necessarily trust my own party's president, but I certainly don't necessarily trust the other party's president. So this was a big debate for a long time. Some of the legislation that authorized trade agreements, and back to the gentleman's the congressman's comments, some of the legislation prohibited inclusion of environmental or human rights issues or labor rights. So they were, in other words, they were saying to the president, we're going to give you authority to negotiate a trade agreement, but we're not going to let the Congress have any input at all on issues of environmental protection, civil human rights, or labor rights. Well, I thought that was ridiculous. And so to take away our ability to stand for principles we believe in for the sake of a trade agreement seemed to me to be a race to the bottom. Because then you have each country saying, well, we can make our workers work longer in less safe conditions for lower wages than your workers are. Then the next country says, we'll work for even less wages, etc. So that's been a real tension in our trade agreements. And it had traditionally divided between Republicans and business saying, give the president fast track authority, no constraints on labor or environmental laws. The Democrats saying we want input on the Congress side. Turn that off, sorry. My apologies. No idea what that's about. So that's part of the politics of it. And to give you a sense of how this plays out politically, I mentioned earlier the people who work on the docks in harbors who load and unload ships are called longshoremen. They make a lot of money in America. They make over $100,000 a year, average person. That's a lot of money. And they have a lot of power. They depend on trade. But there was a trade agreement that I supported. I supported a free trade agreement with a Middle Eastern country. Oh, I just lost my power. Hang on. I need to plug in.
Okay.
It's okay. Sorry. Okay, so this will be one minute or less. So I'll continue on your screen, Juan. Is that all right?
Okay, yeah. Well, what's your,
It's coming back. But it's have the chart.
okay, you're going to talk through
I'll
that.
talk through your screen while this line recharges. So to continue the story, so it was in the middle of the Iraq War. We had, if you know the geography there, you had Oman on one side of the straits, you have Iran on the other side of the straits, and up here is Iraq, where we have 100,000 plus soldiers needing supplies. We were trying to negotiate a free trade agreement with Oman. Well, it seems to me if you have to pass through a very narrow strait and you have an adversary on one side, it's nice to have an ally on the other side. And so I supported the Oman Free Trade Agreement. Not a big deal. It was a few $1 billion of trade a year. The labor union, representing the men and women who work on the ships, said they would no longer support me politically because I supported a free trade agreement. To such an extent that they literally tore a campaign check that was supposed to go to my political campaign, which is questionably legal. They're implying that they're linking a contribution to a vote, which is against the law in our country. But it was explicit. It was, you voted for a trade agreement. We, as labor, as organized labor, we don't like trade, so we're no longer going to support you. And that, by the way, is in the state of Washington, which is the most trade-dependent economy of any state in the country. That's how the politics go on this issue.
But, me gustaría agregar algo importante, lo digo en español. Cuando uno ve, por ejemplo, la cultura política de una nación como los Estados Unidos, que es muy competitiva en términos de comercio internacional, ve que si bien el Ejecutivo ha tomado competencias constitucionales del Congreso, aún así que ha retomado recientemente el Congreso justamente con acuerdos con Taiwán, recientes, que ha retomado ahora recientemente. Pero uno ve que los congresistas americanos se preocupan por el comercio, se preocupan por las exportaciones, se preocupan por sus empresas en sus distritos.
Claro, claro.
Por su bolsillo. Eso no sucede en la Argentina. Nosotros tenemos, y parece un tema menor, Comisión de Relaciones Exteriores, Mercosur, Comercio, Pymes, Economías Regionales. Les puedo nombrar 10 comisiones en el Congreso dedicadas a comercio. Cuando no existe. Y la especialización en comercio, y en comercio exterior y en comercio en general, es muy baja. Entonces, no es por hacer una crítica a nuestro país, simplemente estoy diciendo, es muy difícil defender algo cuando ese algo que se pretende defender no forma parte de la cultura.
Pero porque me parece que tiene que ir a la historia.
So I'll give you another
Es
example.
que la historia es cómo la Argentina nació y cómo nace Estados Unidos.
Yo creo que tiene que ver con una cuestión del paternalismo estatal, etc.
Bueno, pero viene de la historia eso.
Última intervención, Suraj Samin, tú lo conoces, afgano. Vino a la Argentina y yo le hice una pregunta, le conté cómo era el país, una linda historia de nuestro país, y le dije, nosotros tenemos educación gratis, salud gratis, seguridad, obviamente, por el Estado, etc. Digo, pero no es solo para los argentinos, para cualquiera que venga a la Argentina, y tenemos países vecinos, muchísima inmigración, etc. ¿Qué pensás? Me parece maravilloso, me dijo. Y le digo, ¿tenés algún otro segundo pensamiento? ¿Algún segundo pensamiento? Me dijo, no, me parece extraordinario, es el mejor país del mundo. Y yo digo, pero ¿a vos no te parece que habría que pensar cómo hace Argentina para hacer todo eso? Bueno, eso tenemos, pero no somos exitosos. Entonces, ¿cuál es el problema? Que no es, bueno, ahí está la cuestión de lo difícil de ir en contra de una cultura que cree que puede haber un Estado que lo prevé todo y no lo hace. Lo ideológico.
Lo ideológico, la falta de preparación que hablábamos recién.
Y no es de izquierda, no es una cuestión de izquierda.
Y la culpa. Y la culpa. Siempre la culpa la tiene el otro. Usted dice el ejercicio que hace Ryan de tomar un taxi. Y hablábamos. Hice como hace Ryan, pregunta al taxista. ¿Y usted qué opina? Y empezó, la culpa la tiene el imperio de Estados Unidos. La culpa la tiene el Fondo Monetario. Yo le decía, ¿pero usted cree que 40.000 millones de dólares para la Argentina es una cifra que pueda fundir a la Argentina, que no se pueda pagar? Si la Argentina crece, se puede pagar fácilmente. y él insistía. La culpa.
Pero igual si nos dieron el dinero.
¿Te das cuenta? Pero vos fíjate, lo que vos decís es cultural. En vez de.
Pero la cultura se basa en la historia. Si no entendemos esto,
Disculpen a todos los que están allí que quieren intervenir.
sí, sí.
Yeah, let me change the topic a little bit, because I think there's a bigger issue here myself. And it was something the doctor mentioned. We are in an existential battle between democracies and free markets and autocracies and state-run countries. It's existential. It's the ability for us to have a class here and to disagree and criticize the government is in jeopardy worldwide. I was studying Chinese for a time to teach a class in China. I may have mentioned this. And I spent some time. I can't do it there. Why do I say that in this context? Because the doctor made the point about lithium. I think we need to completely revise our international economic groupings and no longer say that autocracies get the same vote as democracies. I think we need to say, look, if this is my belief, but I don't think we have a choice. I think we need to say, if Russia and China and Iran and other dictatorial and Venezuela want to trade together, fine. But the democratic countries are going to trade together one another and help one another. And even if it at the cost of some local jobs, if we have to do that, because if you take Argentina right now, struggling to pay off its IMF situation, and yet sitting on enormous resources. It's in our best interest and the world's best interest to help Argentina, help itself, right? But if they have resources, let's make sure we're working with them to help them produce and develop those resources so that we're strengthening both the economies and the democracies worldwide. And right now, if you look at the makeup of the United Nations, IMF, many other countries, the autocracies are there with roughly equal votes. So my belief is we need to really revisit and support trade agreements across democratic lines, across regional lines, and build new blocks and try to win the economic battle, because the kinetic hot warfare battle is terribly dangerous. That's my take.
So there is a big discussion here in Argentina also.
Yeah.
For some, foreign affairs, no? What is going to happen? For some, it doesn't matter the values, democracy or autocracy. Important is just the economic and commercial interest as a way to defend national interest. For others, no, its values are important.
Yeah.
Where we belong to, if we belong to the Western Hemisphere, or it's the same that we have a relationship with, I don't know, Iran and the States is the same thing. So that's a discussion here in Argentina.
And I think our country has struggled in two ways. One, to be honest, we were on the wrong side of a number of things in the past, the wrong side on human rights issues. And then we moved more towards neglect. I have a slide, I don't know if it'll come up, but a slide looking at where US foreign aid has gone. And when you look at Western Hemisphere, it's tiny. It's tiny amount relative to the Middle East, relative to Iraq, Afghanistan, Israel. It's a tiny amount of aid. And if you look at what the Marshall Plan did, and I understand why we did it, but there are so many other things I think we need to be doing to support friendly nations in the region. And that's why I think it's exciting to do this course and to reach out and say, how can we strengthen those ties economically, politically, through interchanges, etc.
Sometimes US foreign policy is a little difficult to read. For example, Raúl Martínez Pita over there, he was asking to Beatriz Nofal and the Lieutenant Governor about the recent trip from your Commerce Secretary to Taiwan, and not just to Taiwan, even to China, right? Raúl, I don't know if you want to do the question. And we have another background, which is the one of Blinken to
Yes.
the visit to Maduro to Venezuela because of the crisis of oil crisis, or the Germans with the Russian Federation.
Yeah, I mean, this is another concept. You have to get yourself so you're not dependent. Part of the whole trade thing, we made a big mistake in China, in the US. We opened up our universities. Nixon went to China. Our universities, if you went to the University of Washington today, an enormous number of young people from the People's Republic of China are studying at the University of Washington. They're paying,
Study there.
they're paying high amounts of tuition, the cost to go to school. The theory was that they would come here, we would build strong cultural ties, they would go back home, promote the liberalization of their economy and the liberalization of their society. The practice is they come here, they learn about our latest technology, they go back there, they compete with us. And in fairness to them, if you're going back to a country, first of all, it says if you don't come back, we will punish your families because they're still here. And second of all, they say, and when you come back, if you come back and you criticize our system of government, we will imprison you or execute you. So there's a flaw in our theory. This is that people will put democracy over their lives. And look what happened in Tiananmen. And look what happened in Hong Kong. So we believed that liberalizing and opening ourselves up would build a better, brighter world. It was an optimistic vision. It was wrong. It was just flat wrong. And so how now can we work together to try to support democracies and both compete economically and tragically militarily? I mean, that's how I see it. But let me go back to one thing though. You talked about the engagement of your politicians in these trade issues.
Very low.
So we are very involved in that. So on my day in Congress, all the time, representatives from my congressional district were coming to see me. Farmers, manufacturers, high-tech executives, real estate people, everybody. They can come in, we schedule visits, they brief me on their issues, and we work with them. I'll give you one example of the complexities of trade. I supported an initiative to say that if we're going to build American infrastructure, we should build it with American-made steel. I think that's true. Why? Because a powerful nation has to have a strong steel industry. And steel industry takes a lot of physical space. It has to have waterways to transport the material. And if you shut down a steel industry, you'll never get that land back. It'll go into condominiums or something else, malls or some crazy thing. So you have to protect your domestic steel industry because you can't defend your nation without steel. You just can't do it. But little by little, actually pretty rapidly, we've been losing steel fabrication ability in our country. So I'm big on that you have to protect your domestic industries. But there was another company in my district that took a certain kind of rolled steel, the kind you see in these big rolls, and turned that into various products. They could only get that steel from an overseas producer because we're on the West Coast. So to bring the steel across the ocean or across the country by rail is much more expensive than bringing it by ship. So there was an agreement about American-made steel. Me, who's a supporter of domestic steel production, had to go and try to get a little exception for a certain kind of steel that was creating about 500 jobs in my district. And I was able to go to the chairman of the committee, explain the situation, and get a little tiny piece of language that allowed a certain amount of steel, because I worked with the manufacturer to learn what they needed. We wrote specific language to allow them to get that steel, because otherwise we would lose the job. Otherwise we would import the finished product and lose the manufacturer.
An exception.
An exception. but that's how involved we were. That's how at the micro level, working with industries and with the trade negotiators to look out for our interests. And that's true for everything from cherries to hay, to alfalfa hay. This is, you know your district and you know what's there.
Los ejércitos nacionales tienen como necesidad de tener industria militar.
Sí.
Sin acero, ¿cómo se puede tener una industria militar?
You can't. You have to have steel for military. And you have to have chips. You have to have computer chips. The limiting, one of the limiting factors in Ukraine is ammunition, but another one is drones. China makes the drones, and Ukraine is using the drones. If China suddenly shuts off drones, and meanwhile, we've given, I think mistakenly, we've given Elon Musk control over space and over satellite. I think that's crazy. My own belief is, and I'm not big on nationalizing things, but I think we ought to internationalize Elon Musk's network of Starlink satellites, because nobody gave him space. I don't understand how we've done that. How we've.
Why?
Why? I don't think we should do it. So you're right. We have to make strategic decisions about what kind of manufacturing, what kind of resources allow us to defend ourselves. And otherwise, what happens is little by little, you lose that, or you become dependent on external sources. When Denny talked about the supply chain problem, I don't know if you saw these pictures. We had so many ships waiting to unload in our harbors. Los Angeles Harbor had hundreds of ships, hundreds waiting. I mean, literally, you could see as far as the eye could see, there were these giant ships anchored, and ships that would normally take 3 or 4 days to get across the ocean, 1 or 2 more days to unload. Suddenly there were 2, 3, 4 months delayed. So if you get your supply chain dependent on other countries, you really have a problem. That question was asked.
And how is the alignment between the real agenda of the United States and the agenda of the Congress?
Well, that's an interesting question. It depends on the president and it depends on the party. Trump channeled a lot of anger and frustration at China. And remember that the trade with China was not just, as I described before, based on a theory that, oh, they will liberalize their economy and democratize their government. It was also based on, 1.3 billion people. We could sell a lot to 1.3 billion people. So the theory was, let's liberalize their economy and we could sell American goods, like iPhones. And that's, by the way, that's why Boeing produces so much in other countries, because the country said, we will buy Boeing airplanes for our national airlines if you make a portion of the Boeing airline in our country. So Boeing has a huge 747, specially fit out. It looks like a giant whale or something. Yes. And it hauls wings, prefabricated carbon fiber wings made overseas. Every day, this big plane lands multiple times at Boeing Field, which is wonderful because you open up markets. But what happens? You also give your technology away. Because when the people start fabricating the technology, you lose the fabrication ability. And they learn it, whether that's batteries, carbon fiber, chip manufacturing. There's a marvelous article by the founder of Intel, Andy Grove. And he made, we should finish with this. Andy Grove, about 20 years ago, he made this argument. In the West, we believe that capitalist free enterprise on its own is by definition the best way to grow an economy. But if you're competing against government, state subsidized industries with a long-term strategic vision and strategic subsidies that can cut the prices And does it have to deal with environmental, labor, other human rights regulations? How can a free enterprise state, a private business, compete against an entire other country that is strategically trying to undermine your industries? And Andy Grove, who was one of the champions of free enterprise, said, we have made an enormous mistake. And he gave the example of batteries. He said, the battery technology that the world has been using for the last 50 years, and it almost always the new advances came from American scientists, US based, right? Sometimes German, sometimes other Western, but heavily US based. And he said, and then what happened? Well, we decided we could manufacture these batteries cheaper somewhere overseas. So we took the American technology, let it be manufactured overseas. Then what happened? We lost the feel for how to deal with the material, and they gained the technology and the factory, and our best technology got exported along with the jobs, but more importantly, along with the knowledge for how to create the materials and how to innovate. And there was this arrogant American attitude for years. Well, they can manufacture, but they can't innovate. Not so.
Not so.
Not so. And now we're reaping that, because actually the numbers of patents coming out of China are rivaling the US patents, and we've lost the manufacturing base. That's what Biden and the CHIPS Act were all about, trying to restore that capacity. Well, I'm sorry, we've got one question.
Yes.
Yes, he probably knows more than me, so I should shut up.
No, I just wanted to ask real quickly what you think of the agreement to manufacture for GE to manufacture the fighter jet engines in India, which was agreed during Prime Minister Modi's visit to Washington, which would seem to go in line with what you're saying as far as sort of taking manufacturing overseas, but at the same time, it would provide India with greater capability to contain, let's say, or to have more of a military capability to against China in that region, and sort of, to assist U.S. efforts and perhaps even, relieve U.S. forces or back up U.S. forces in trying to contain China?
Well, it's a great question. The last time I checked, the Prime Minister of India has not said at any point, I will defend the United States even at the cost of my own country. Everything I've seen from the Prime Minister of India has been the reverse. I don't personally see India as a very reliable ally. And I worry about both the security of the technology and our reliance on a fundamental infrastructure piece for our military being built overseas by a country that frankly has a very questionable human rights record, and likes to play both sides, I think, between Russia and the US. Yes, they but China, that's important, but I would keep that manufacturing domestic if I could. And I don't see that we benefit. My own belief is I don't see how we benefit as a nation or as a region, broadly Western Hemisphere, by that transaction. That's my belief. I think it's a mistake.
No.
So this has been a fascinating. Thank you, everybody, for the good questions and the good participation. So next week is Feria, right?
We have no class.
No class next week. The following week, I'm super excited. I want to put in a plug for this. We have an amazing class in 2 weeks. First, there will be at least 2, possibly more, former members of Congress here who will start the discussion. That will be followed by the former head of the Congressional Budget Office, an advisor to presidential candidate John McCain, a gentleman named Doug Holtz-Aiken, who was head of Congressional Budget Office when I was on the Budget Committee. Brilliant guy. We'll have some insights that Argentina, given its fiscal situation, may be interested in, to say the least. And that will be followed by a former U.S. ambassador to India, Tim Romer, who's I served with in Congress. He was U.S. ambassador to India. So we can ask him that question. He'll be smarter than me. So 3 outstanding speakers in the next 2 weeks as well. So thank you, everyone.
We have 22 employees at the Convention Manager Office of Argentina, plus 5 directors and the director general. So I'm going to invite
Doug is really great, very honest. He's kind of right. I respect him immensely. I always felt he gave us this. We'll talk about CBO when we come. He's great.
Wonderful. Muchas
Thanks,
gracias
everyone.
a los que están en Europa también. Chao.
¿Quién está en Europa?
Hay alguna por ahí.
Ah, está
Raúl.
Raúl. Chao, Raúl.